Picture yourself standing in the heart of ancient Alexandria, the air thick with the scent of papyrus and cedar oil. You pass through grand colonnades into a vast hall where countless scrolls are meticulously stacked, a silent testament to the entire collected knowledge of the known world. This was the legendary Library of Alexandria, a beacon of learning so immense it was said to hold every book ever written. But then, picture that light being snuffed out. The halls fall silent, the scrolls turn to ash, and a profound darkness descends, leaving behind only whispers and a haunting question: what incredible wisdom was lost to us forever? The burning of the Library of Alexandria is one of history's most famous tragedies, a symbol of cultural annihilation that still echoes through the centuries. But what if I told you that Alexandria was not alone? It was merely one chapter in a much larger, more heartbreaking story of loss. This is a journey into the shadows of history, a quest to uncover the tales of 25 lost libraries of the ancient world. These were not just buildings, they were the very memory of civilizations, the collective genius of philosophers, scientists, and poets, all meticulously preserved for future generations. From the royal archives of Assyrian kings to the scholarly sanctuaries of the Hellenistic world, these repositories held the answers to questions we are only now beginning to ask. Their destruction was more than just the loss of physical objects. It was a severing of our connection to the past, a collective amnesia that has left gaps in our understanding of who we are and where we came from. Imagine the plays of Sophocles that we will never read, the astronomical charts of Babylon we will never study, the entire histories of empires that have vanished without a trace. Together, we will venture into the ruins of these forgotten institutions, piecing together their stories from archaeological fragments and ancient texts. We will explore the grandeur of their creation and the mystery of their disappearance, from fires and invasions to the slow decay of time. This is more than a list of fallen buildings. It is a recovery mission for the human spirit, an attempt to reclaim a legacy that was stolen from us. So prepare to be transported across millennia, to walk the silent corridors of knowledge once more and discover the incredible, tragic, and utterly fascinating stories of the 25 libraries that time forgot. The adventure into the echoes of lost wisdom starts now. Our journey begins with the most iconic of all, the library that has become synonymous with the very idea of lost knowledge, the Royal Library of Alexandria. Founded in the 3rd century before the Common Era by Ptolemy I, a general of Alexander the Great who became the ruler of Egypt, this was not merely a repository for books. It was a monument to human ambition, an institution born from a radical and breathtaking goal: to gather a copy of every single scroll in the entire known world. Imagine the audacity of that project. Delegates were sent to every port and major city, funded by the vast wealth of the Ptolemaic dynasty, with instructions to purchase, borrow, or copy every text they could find. Ships arriving in Alexandria's bustling harbor were reportedly searched by royal guards, not for contraband but for scrolls. Any found were confiscated, copied by an army of scribes, and then the copies were returned to the owners while the originals were added to the library's ever-growing collection. This relentless acquisition fueled an intellectual golden age. The library was part of a larger research complex known as the Mausoleum, or the Temple of the Muses, which functioned like the world's first great university. Within its halls, the greatest minds of the age were given stipends to live, work, and debate freely. It was here that the astronomer Aristarchus of Samos first proposed that the Earth revolved around the Sun, a concept that would be forgotten for nearly 2,000 years. The geographer and mathematician Eratosthenes not only calculated the circumference of our planet with astonishing accuracy, but also created one of the first maps of the world incorporating lines of longitude and latitude. The physician Herophilus pioneered human dissection, making groundbreaking discoveries about the brain and the nervous system. This was a place where knowledge was not just stored, it was created, challenged, and expanded in ways that would shape the course of science and philosophy for centuries. Yet for all its glory, the library's end is shrouded in as much mystery as its contents. The popular imagination often blames a single, catastrophic fire, but the historical reality is far more complex and gradual. The first major blow likely came during Julius Caesar's civil war in 48 before the Common Era. Besieged in the city, Caesar's forces set fire to the Egyptian fleet in the harbor, and ancient historians like Plutarch record that the flames accidentally spread to the city, destroying at least a portion of the library's vast collection stored in warehouses near the docks. This was a devastating loss, but it was not the absolute end. The library, or a significant part of it, persisted for centuries more, likely suffering from repeated episodes of neglect, political violence, and further damage. The final death knell is a subject of fierce debate among historians. Some point to the Emperor Aurelian's sack of the city in the late 3rd century, when the entire royal quarter where the library was housed was laid waste. Others suggest it was a consequence of the changing religious landscape, such as the decree by the Christian Emperor Theodosius in the late 4th century that called for the destruction of pagan temples, which could have included the library as a symbol of the old faith. And then there is the often cited, though heavily disputed, story involving the Caliph Omar in the 7th century, who supposedly declared that if the library's books agreed with the Quran, they were superfluous, and if they disagreed, they were heretical, and thus ordered them used as fuel for the city's bathhouses for 6 months. While most modern scholars dismiss this later tale as a myth invented centuries after the fact, it speaks to the powerful and enduring symbol the library had become, a universal emblem of knowledge destroyed by intolerance. The true tragedy of Alexandria's loss is not just the burning of papyrus and ink, it is the silencing of a conversation. We lost entire plays by Aeschylus and Sophocles, detailed histories of civilizations that have since faded from memory, and scientific treatises that could have accelerated human progress by a millennium. The library's destruction represents a profound fork in the road of history, a path not taken. It stands as a permanent, haunting reminder of the fragility of our collective memory and the immense price we pay when we allow the lights of learning to be extinguished. But while Alexandria famously sought to collect every book in the world, it had a brilliant and formidable competitor in the East, a library born from a rivalry so intense it literally changed the material on which history was written. Journey with us now to the ancient city of Pergamum, perched on a dramatic hilltop in what is now Turkey. Here, the Attalid kings aspired to create a second Athens, a cultural capital that could challenge the preeminence of Alexandria itself. And at the heart of this ambition was the great Library of Pergamum, an institution so magnificent and so stocked with knowledge that it sparked an intellectual trade war. The most legendary tale surrounding its rise involves a desperate Egyptian plot to stifle its growth. As the story goes, the Ptolemies in Alexandria, growing jealous of Pergamum's rapidly expanding collection, made a drastic move. They imposed a complete embargo on the export of papyrus, the essential writing material of the ancient world. They believed that by cutting off the supply of paper, they could strangle their rival's library in its cradle, but the Attalids refused to be defeated. Faced with a critical shortage of papyrus, the scholars and craftsmen of Pergamum were forced to innovate, and they turned to an older, more durable medium that they could produce locally, animal skins. They perfected a method of cleaning, stretching, and smoothing sheep and calf skins to create a fine, thin, and incredibly flexible writing surface. This new material was so superior for binding into book form that it became known as Charta Pergamna, literally, paper of Pergamum. From this term, we get our word parchment. This was a technological revolution born from a blockade. While papyrus scrolls were brittle and could crumble at the edges, parchment was tough, could be written on both sides, and was far more durable in the damp climates of Europe. This innovation didn't just save the Library of Pergamum. It would eventually preserve a vast portion of the classical texts that survived the fall of Rome, as medieval scribes meticulously copied ancient works onto this robust new material. The library itself became a powerhouse of scholarship, particularly under the rule of King Eumenes II, who aggressively expanded its holdings, aiming to create a collection of over 200,000 scrolls. It wasn't just a repository, it was a center for a different school of thought. While Alexandria was famous for its scientific and mathematical rigor, Pergamum became the heart of textual criticism and literary analysis, home to philosophers who favored a more allegorical and philosophical interpretation of texts. The city's very Acropolis was designed as a monumental testament to learning and power, with the library complex situated prominently near the temples of Athena and Dionysus, symbolizing a divine sponsorship of the arts and wisdom. To walk its colonnades would have been to experience a symphony of intellectual activity, with scholars debating in the shade of its porticos and scribes busily copying texts onto the very parchment that had secured the library's independence. Yet, the glory of Pergamum was not destined to last forever. Its fate became entangled with the rising power of Rome, when the last Attalid king, Attalus III, died without an heir in 133 before the Common Era. He bequeathed his entire kingdom, including the legendary library, to the Roman Republic. This event marked the beginning of the end for Pergamum as an independent center of learning. While the library likely persisted for some time, its vast collection was gradually dispersed. There is a compelling, though not universally accepted, theory put forth by the great historian Plutarch that a large portion of Pergamum's collection was later given as a gift by the Roman general Mark Antony to Cleopatra in Alexandria to help replenish the shelves of the rival library after Caesar's fire. The poetic symmetry is almost too perfect to ignore. The great rival's collection, absorbed by the very institution it sought to challenge, its scrolls and parchments becoming part of the very legend of Alexandria's loss. Whether this specific transfer happened or not, the great library of Pergamum slowly faded from history, its buildings repurposed, its scholars scattered, and its innovative spirit living on only in the word parchment, a permanent echo of a time when the thirst for knowledge was so fierce it could spark a war over paper. While the great public libraries of Alexandria and Pergamum were monuments to royal ambition, our next story takes us into the intimate world of a private scholar, a collection not meant for the masses but for personal contemplation and pleasure. This library, unlike any other, did not crumble into dust over centuries. It was frozen in a single, terrifying moment. We travel now to the Roman town of Herculaneum, a seaside resort for the elite that, along with its more famous neighbor Pompeii, faced the full fury of Mount Vesuvius in the year 79 of the Common Era. The same superheated pyroclastic surge that instantly killed the town's inhabitants also sealed its fate, burying Herculaneum under layers of volcanic ash and mud that hardened into rock, preserving the entire city in a remarkable state. And deep within this buried city lay a magnificent villa, so lavish and filled with exquisite sculptures that archaeologists named it the Villa of the Papyri. It was here in the 1700s that workers digging a well stumbled upon the ruins of this grand home. As they excavated, they made an astonishing discovery. In a room by the villa's courtyard, they found what appeared to be lumps of charcoal stacked neatly on shelves. At first, they mistook them for burnt logs or pieces of coal and carelessly discarded many. But the site's engineer, a man named Carl Weber, had a moment of brilliant intuition. He noticed that some of these charred blocks had a peculiar, rolled-up shape. He realized with growing excitement that they were not logs at all. They were ancient scrolls carbonized by the volcano's intense heat. The volcanic material had baked them solid, turning them into fragile, blackened cylinders. but it had also preserved their structure where ordinary fire would have turned them to ash in an instant. In total, over 1,800 of these scrolls were recovered from this one room, creating the only intact library from the classical world to have survived into the modern era. For centuries, these scrolls presented an almost insurmountable challenge. They were far too brittle to unroll. Any attempt would cause them to crumble into fragments, destroying the very text they held. Scholars could only gaze upon this incredible treasure trove, knowing it was filled with lost knowledge but utterly unable to access it. That is, until the dawn of modern technology. Today, an international team of scientists and classicists is using the most advanced tools imaginable to peer inside these carbonized lumps without ever physically touching them. They employ techniques like sophisticated X-ray phase contrast tomography, a type of three-dimensional scanning developed for medical imaging, which can differentiate between the carbon-based ink and the carbonized papyrus. This allows them to virtually unroll the scrolls inside a computer, looking for the subtle textural differences that form letters and words. It is a painstaking process, like trying to read the ghost of a text, but it is working. Word by word, line by line, these lost works are beginning to speak to us again after nearly 2,000 years of silence. And what are these scrolls telling us? The collection of the Villa of the Papyri offers a breathtakingly personal glimpse into the mind of its owner, almost certainly the Roman father-in-law of Julius Caesar, a wealthy man named Lucius Calpurnius Piso. His library was not a random assortment. It had a distinct and powerful philosophical focus. The vast majority of the works identified so far are texts from the Epicurean school of thought. This philosophy, founded by Epicurus, taught that the goal of life was to attain a state of tranquil happiness, free from fear and pain, achieved through the moderation of desires, the cultivation of friendships, and the withdrawal from the anxieties of political life. To have a library so dedicated to one philosophy suggests a man who was not just a casual collector, but a devoted practitioner, someone who built his seaside villa as a literal and philosophical sanctuary from the tumult of Roman politics. As researchers slowly decode more of the scrolls, they are recovering lost works by Epicurus's most important follower, the poet and philosopher Philodemus of Gadara. His writings, previously known only through a few fragments quoted by other authors, are now being read in their entirety. We are gaining new insights into his thoughts on ethics, rhetoric, and even the philosophy of music. This is not just about recovering old texts, it's about reconstructing an entire intellectual world. The Villa of the Papyri gives us a time capsule of Roman intellectual life at its most personal, showing us how a sophisticated Roman aristocrat engaged with the big questions of existence. Every new scroll successfully scanned is like receiving a letter from the ancient world, a direct communication from a mind that was silenced by a volcano but is now miraculously finding its voice once more. As we leave behind the ash-preserved scrolls of Herculaneum, our journey through the lost libraries of the ancient world now takes a dramatic turn eastward and forward in time, to a city that stood as a bastion of light while the rest of Europe descended into what we often call the Dark Ages. This is the story of the Imperial Library of Constantinople, the great memory bank of the Eastern Roman Empire, an institution that for over 1,000 years served as the primary guardian of classical knowledge. While the Western Roman Empire crumbled under the weight of invasion and political collapse, its eastern counterpart, with its magnificent capital on the Bosporus Strait, endured. And at the heart of this enduring civilization was a library founded not at the city's glorious beginning by Constantine the Great, but by his son, Constantius II, in the mid-4th century. His vision was starkly practical and profoundly important: to systematically collect, copy, and preserve the fragile literary heritage of both Greece and Rome, creating a centralized repository that could weather the storms of time. The scale of this preservation effort was monumental. the library was housed within the sprawling grounds of the imperial palace, a clear signal of its importance to the state. Scribes and scholars worked in dedicated scriptoriums, their primary mission being the relentless transcription of aging papyrus scrolls onto a far more durable medium parchment and vellum. Think of the countless texts they saved, the philosophical dialogues of Plato, the epic poems of Homer, the historical narratives of Herodotus and Thucydides, the scientific and mathematical treatises of figures like Euclid and Archimedes. Many of these works existed in only a handful of copies scattered across the Mediterranean, vulnerable to fire, decay, or simple neglect. The librarians of Constantinople actively sought them out, creating a kind of cultural backup system. This was not merely an act of hoarding, it was an act of salvation. While monastic scriptoria in the West would later take up this mantle, it was the imperial library that provided the foundational texts, the very source material from which so much of our classical understanding flows. It became the indispensable bridge between the intellectual world of antiquity and the scholarly reawakening of the Renaissance. Yet, safeguarding this treasure for a millennium was a feat that required surviving a relentless series of catastrophes. The library's history is punctuated by devastating fires, each one a potential extinction-level event for the knowledge it held. A major blaze in the year 477 destroyed a significant portion of the original collection. But the Byzantines were nothing if not resilient. Each time disaster struck, a monumental effort of restoration began. Emperors like Leo the Magician and the scholarly patriarch Photios in the 9th century spearheaded ambitious campaigns to recover and recopy lost works, demonstrating an unwavering commitment to their role as custodians of civilization itself. They understood that the library was more than books, it was the empire's soul. The most grievous wound, however, was not inflicted by accident but by deliberate betrayal. In the year 1204, the unthinkable happened. The armies of the Fourth Crusade, supposedly en route to fight Muslims in the Holy Land, were diverted by Venetian intrigues and internal greed to instead attack the Christian city of Constantinople. What followed was a 3-day orgy of destruction and looting that shocked even the contemporaries of the era. The Crusaders, driven by a desire for plunder, rampaged through the city, desecrating its most sacred churches and palaces. The Imperial Library was a prime target. While the precise fate of its contents remains debated, countless manuscripts were undoubtedly torn apart for their precious bindings, burned, or simply scattered and lost. Priceless, irreplaceable codices were thrown into the streets or used as kindling. This was not the calculated destruction of a rival power, but a chaotic, ignorant vandalism that severed a direct link to the ancient past. The sack of 1204 was a blow from which the library and the empire itself never fully recovered. Though a shadow of its former self, the library persisted in some form for another 250 years, a flickering flame in a steadily dimming room. Its final, tragic end came with the fall of Constantinople itself in 1453. As the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II's forces breached the legendary Theodosian walls, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, died fighting in the streets. In the ensuing chaos of the final sack, whatever remained of the imperial library was almost certainly dispersed, destroyed, or carried off as spoils of war. Some manuscripts were rescued by Greek scholars who fled to the west, bringing their precious books with them and directly fueling the Italian Renaissance with the very classical knowledge their library had so long protected. But the great institution itself, the organized, state-supported guardian of 1,000 years of history, was gone. The fall of the Imperial Library of Constantinople represents the closing of a final chapter, the extinguishing of the last great beacon of the ancient world. Its long, defiant stand against the tides of chaos and ignorance makes its loss not just a tragedy, but the end of an era, a silent testament to the immense cost of preserving the light of knowledge against the encroaching dark. But to truly understand the roots of library science, we must journey back even further beyond the marble halls of Greece and Rome to the dusty, sun-baked plains of ancient Mesopotamia. Here, in the formidable capital of the Assyrian Empire, we find a library unlike any that had come before it. This was the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal, established in the 7th century before the Common Era in the magnificent city of Nineveh. Ashurbanipal was not your typical conquering king. While he was a ruthless and powerful warrior who expanded his empire with brutal efficiency, he was also a man of profound and unexpected erudition. He was one of the few ancient Mesopotamian rulers who was fully literate, proudly boasting in his own inscriptions that he had learned the complex art of cuneiform writing and could read texts in the ancient Sumerian language as well as his native Akkadian. His passion for knowledge was not a hobby, it was an obsession that he wielded as an instrument of state power. His method for building his library was as systematic as it was imperial. He did not just send out buyers, he sent out teams of scribes and scholars to every corner of his vast empire, from the scholarly centers of Babylon to the distant conquered cities. Their mission was explicit: to seek out, copy, and bring back to Nineveh every significant text they could find. In some cases, entire collections were simply confiscated as spoils of war. This was intellectual acquisition on a staggering scale, a deliberate and comprehensive effort to centralize the entire knowledge base of the Mesopotamian world under one royal roof. The result was a collection of over 30,000 cuneiform tablets, a priceless archive that covered every conceivable aspect of ancient life. The contents of this library were breathtaking in their scope. It was not merely a collection of royal annals or religious hymns, though it had those in abundance. It was, in effect, the world's first known universal library. The tablets were meticulously organized by subject, a revolutionary concept for its time. There were sections for omen texts, which priests used to predict the future by examining the livers of sheep or the patterns of stars. There were vast repositories of medical knowledge, with detailed descriptions of symptoms and treatments using herbs and minerals. There were legal codes, dictionaries for translating between languages, elaborate astronomical observations, and complex mathematical tables. But perhaps the most stunning discovery to come from this trove was a literary masterpiece that had been lost to the world for over 2 millennia. Tucked away on a series of 12 clay tablets was the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest great work of literature. This epic poem tells the story of a legendary king's quest for immortality, his deep friendship with the wild man Enkidu, and his confrontation with the fundamental truths of life and death. Finding Gilgamesh was like hearing the voice of an entire civilization speak across the centuries, revealing a humanity that was, in its hopes and fears, remarkably like our own. For centuries, this immense repository of knowledge lay completely forgotten, buried under the rubble of Nineveh after it was sacked and burned by a coalition of Babylonian and Median armies in 612 before the Common Era. The library's own existence faded into myth until the 19th century, when a series of daring archaeological expeditions, led by British adventurer Austin Henry Layard and his Iraqi assistant Hormozd Rassam, began to excavate the great mounds that marked the site of the ancient Assyrian capital. What they unearthed surpassed all imagination. They found room after room filled with the shattered remains of the palace, and within those ruins they discovered something extraordinary. The shelves and furniture had long since turned to dust, but the clay tablets themselves had survived. The very fire that destroyed the city had ironically baked and hardened the tablets, preserving them for posterity in a layer of ash. It was a moment of unparalleled historical discovery, as if a time capsule from the dawn of civilization had been deliberately sealed and waiting for them. The significance of Ashurbanipal's library cannot be overstated. It stands as a monumental first in human history. While other collections existed, this was the first we know of that was systematically assembled, catalogued, and organized with a clear scholarly purpose. It represents the moment humanity began to consciously collect and structure its own accumulated wisdom, moving from oral tradition and scattered records to a centralized institution dedicated to preserving knowledge for its own sake. The fire that consumed Nineveh could not destroy the hardened clay, and thanks to the obsessive drive of a literate king, we can today read the words, the laws, the stories, and the dreams of a people who lived nearly 3,000 years ago. The Library of Ashurbanipal is not just a collection of artifacts, it is the foundation stone of our own memory, a powerful reminder that the urge to record, to understand, and to preserve is one of humanity's most ancient and defining impulses. From the imperial clay tablets of Assyria, we now travel to a place of profound peace and scholarship, a university library that was so vast it was said to be housed in buildings so tall they cast long shadows across the entire intellectual landscape of Asia. Welcome to Nalanda in the ancient kingdom of Magadha, modern-day Bihar in India. Founded in the 5th century of the Common Era, Nalanda University grew over 700 years into the greatest center of learning the world had ever seen, attracting scholars and students from as far away as Tibet, China, Korea, and Central Asia. At its heart, fueling this immense intellectual engine, was its legendary library known as Dharmaganya, or Treasury of Truth. This was not a single building but a colossal complex of 3 monumental, multi-story structures that stood at the very center of the campus, each one a fortress of knowledge with its own evocative name. Ratnasagara, the ocean of jewels, Ratnadadhi, the sea of jewels, and Ratnaranujaka, the delighter of jewels. These names were not mere poetic flourishes, they were a literal reflection of the priceless wisdom contained within. The largest of these, Ratnadadhi, was a breathtaking 9 stories high, a towering architectural marvel that dominated the skyline. Imagine walking through its vast halls where thousands of manuscripts were meticulously organized and catalogued. The collection was staggering, estimated by ancient accounts to hold hundreds of thousands of texts. The scope was encyclopedic, reaching far beyond the core curriculum of Buddhist philosophy and scripture. While it housed priceless copies of the Prajnaparamita Sutras and other sacred Buddhist texts meticulously copied on palm leaves, its shelves also groaned under the weight of vast secular knowledge. There were exhaustive volumes on grammar, medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. There were treatises on logic and metaphysics from various Indian philosophical schools, detailed texts on the arts, architecture, and even combat. This was a universal library in the truest sense, a place where the entire known corpus of human knowledge was gathered, studied, and debated. The library was the vibrant, beating heart of the university. It supported a community of over 10,000 students and 2,000 teachers, creating an academic ecosystem of unparalleled richness. The process of knowledge preservation was a continuous, sacred endeavor. An army of scribes worked tirelessly in scriptoriums, constantly copying and recopying aging manuscripts to ensure their survival. Scholars from across Asia would arrive with texts from their own lands to be added to the collection, and they would spend years meticulously copying Nalanda's treasured works to take back to their homelands. In this way, the library at Nalanda acted as a great pump, circulating knowledge and spiritual teachings throughout the continent, influencing the development of cultures from the Himalayas to the Japanese islands. This magnificent world of learning came to a sudden, violent, and catastrophic end around the year 1200. A Turco-Afghan military commander named Bakhtiar Khilji, leading his cavalry on a campaign of expansion, descended upon the region. The stories told by Persian historians of the era are chilling in their stark description. Khilji, apparently mistaking the vast university for a fortified military city, or perhaps simply viewing its immense wealth and non-Islamic scholarly tradition as a target, laid siege to Nalanda. The Buddhist monks and students, who were predominantly pacifists, put up a brave but futile resistance. The aftermath was a scene of utter devastation. Khilji's forces ransacked the campus, and they put the great library complex to the torch. The scale of the destruction was so immense that it entered the realm of legend. It was said that the vast stores of palm leaf and paper manuscripts sealed within the towering library buildings created a fire so immense and so fuel-rich that it burned for 3 full months. The air, once filled with the scent of incense and scholarly debate, was now thick with the acrid smoke of incinerated knowledge. The ocean of jewels and the sea of jewels were drained dry, their priceless contents turned to ash. Thousands of monks were said to have been beheaded or burned alive, and the surviving scholars were forced to flee, scattering the last remnants of Nalanda's intellectual tradition across Asia. While some texts had been carried to safety in Tibet, Nepal, and other regions in the preceding centuries, the destruction of Dharmaganya represented an incalculable loss. Entire schools of Buddhist thought, unique philosophical commentaries, centuries of astronomical data, and advanced medical knowledge vanished forever in that long, slow burn. The ruins of Nalanda lay forgotten for centuries, a silent, overgrown monument to one of history's most devastating acts of cultural annihilation, a stark reminder of how quickly 1,000 years of accumulated light can be deliberately and utterly extinguished. While the great libraries of Alexandria and Nalanda represent vast universal collections, some of the most poignant losses are the smaller, more intimate archives that held the unique voice and history of a single people. Tucked away within the sacred precincts of ancient Jerusalem, a different kind of royal library once existed, not of a global empire but of the Kingdom of Judah. This library is not known from grand archaeological ruins, but from the pages of the Hebrew Bible, where it is mentioned as a repository for the official records of the kings. Imagine a collection housed within the royal palace or the temple itself, containing scrolls of administrative documents, chronicles of military campaigns, legal decrees, and perhaps even early literary and poetic works that define the nation's identity. This was the state memory of Judah, the written soul of a people bound by covenant and history. Its existence speaks to a sophisticated bureaucratic and literary culture, one capable of preserving its story for future generations. The physical evidence for this library emerged from the dust of modern Jerusalem in a discovery as dramatic as it was subtle. In the 1980s, archaeologist Yigal Shiloh was excavating an area known as the City of David, the oldest part of Jerusalem. In a layer of ash and destruction unmistakably dated to the early 6th century before the Common Era, his team uncovered a trove of tiny, fired clay lumps. These were not tablets but bully seal impressions. In the ancient world, important documents written on papyrus or parchment were rolled, tied with a string, and then a dollop of soft clay was placed over the knot and stamped with the sender's official seal. These bulli acted as both a lock and a signature. The fire that consumed the building during the Babylonian conquest had ironically baked these clay seals hard, preserving them perfectly while the precious scrolls they once secured were incinerated into nothingness. The bulli survived as silent, three-dimensional negatives of the library that was lost. Studying these seals is like reading the ghost of an entire administration. Many are inscribed with names, some of which are strikingly familiar. Impressions have been found bearing the names of biblical figures like Gemariah, son of Shaphan, a royal scribe mentioned in the book of Jeremiah, and Jerahmeel, a royal official commanded by King Jehoiakim to arrest the prophet Jeremiah and his scribe Baruch. To hold one of these bulli is to hold the very seal that once authenticated a scroll handled by these historical individuals. It provides a tangible, archaeological link to the world described in the biblical texts, corroborating the existence of a sophisticated royal chancery. The concentration of these bulli in one specific burned location strongly suggests they were stored together, having fallen from the burning shelves that held the scrolls they once sealed. This was not a random collection of personal letters. This was the archive of the kingdom, the central filing system for the state's most vital records. The agent of this library's destruction is known to us with chilling certainty: the Babylonian army under King Nebuchadnezzar II. In 586 before the Common Era, after a brutal 18-month siege that brought the city to its knees through starvation and desperation, the Babylonians finally breached Jerusalem's walls. The ensuing destruction was systematic and total. The books of Kings and Jeremiah in the Hebrew Bible describe in harrowing detail how the royal palace, the grand temple of Solomon, and all the great houses of the city were set ablaze. The walls were torn down and the city's elite were taken into exile in Babylon. It is within this cataclysmic event that the Royal Library of Judah almost certainly met its end. The layer of ash containing the bully is the silent archaeological testimony to that final, fiery hour. The Babylonians were not seeking to destroy knowledge specifically. They were intent on erasing Judah's political and religious identity, on breaking its spirit so completely it could never rebel again. Burning the center of government, including its archives, was a standard tactic for annihilating a nation's sovereignty. The loss represented by this single library is profound in a way that is different from the universal collections of Alexandria. We did not lose the works of Greek philosophers here. We lost the unique, irreplaceable records of the Kingdom of Judah itself. Gone are the official royal annals, the detailed histories referenced by the biblical authors themselves, works like the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. These would have provided a much fuller, more nuanced picture of the kingdom's politics, its economic life, and its interactions with neighboring powers like Egypt and Assyria. We likely lost early versions of Psalms, wisdom literature, and prophetic oracles that never made it into the finalized biblical canon. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls centuries later shows us that there was a diversity of textual tradition. The Jerusalem Library would have held some of the earliest versions of these works. Its destruction created a permanent void in our understanding of ancient Judahite society, forcing us to rely on a curated, later compilation of texts and the mute testimony of archaeology. The bully are all that remain, tiny, fired clay witnesses to the vast ocean of history that was swallowed by the flames of conquest. A poignant reminder that every lost library takes with it a unique and unrecoverable perspective on the human story. Yet the story of lost libraries is not always one of a single catastrophic fire. Sometimes it is a slower, more insidious erosion, a dispersal of knowledge so gradual it is almost imperceptible until a treasure is nearly gone. For this chapter, we leave the Mediterranean and South Asia behind and turn our gaze to the southern edge of the vast Sahara Desert, to the fabled city of Timbuktu. From the 13th to the 16th centuries, this remote urban center was a dazzling nexus of trade and scholarship, a place where camel caravans carrying gold and salt were met by caravans of ideas. Timbuktu became one of the great intellectual capitals of the Islamic world, a reputation built not upon one grand state-sponsored library, but upon a constellation of countless private and family-owned collections. In the homes of its scholars and merchants, tucked away in carved wooden chests and special alcoves, resided an immense and breathtaking heritage, hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. This was a city whose walls were lined not with stone, but with paper and ink. The sheer volume and quality of these texts defied the common perception of pre-colonial Africa. These were not simple scrolls or rudimentary records. They were sophisticated, beautifully illuminated manuscripts written in exquisite Arabic calligraphy, often on durable paper imported from across the Mediterranean. The subjects they covered revealed a scholarly culture of remarkable depth and breadth. There were advanced astronomical treatises used to calculate the precise timing of religious observances and to navigate the featureless desert by the stars. There were medical texts detailing complex surgical procedures and listing vast pharmacopoeias of local herbs and minerals for treatments. There were intricate legal documents outlining the sophisticated civic codes that governed the city, and philosophical debates that engaged with thinkers from across the Muslim world. One family library might hold a unique commentary on Islamic law, while another safeguarded a poetic work that blended local Songhai traditions with classical Arabic forms. This decentralized model meant that the knowledge of Timbuktu was woven directly into the fabric of its community, protected and curated across generations as a sacred family trust. For centuries, this system worked, but the very decentralization that protected the libraries from a single Alexandria-style catastrophe also made them profoundly vulnerable to a slower, more complex set of threats. The decline began with the city's falling fortunes. Moroccan invasions in the late 16th century shattered the stability of the region, disrupting the trade routes and patronage that supported its scholars. As Timbuktu's economic and political power waned, so did its ability to safeguard its written heritage. Many families facing hardship were forced to sell off pieces of their collections. Others, seeking better opportunities, migrated away from the city, taking their manuscripts with them and leading to a gradual diaspora of Timbuktu's knowledge across West Africa. The environment of the Sahara itself became an enemy. The relentless, dry heat and abrasive sandstorms slowly brittled the paper, while insects and moisture lurking in the mud brick houses where the manuscripts were stored posed a constant, silent threat. This was a battle against entropy itself, a slow-motion race against decay that many collections ultimately lost. The modern era brought new and terrifying dangers. The late 20th and early 21st centuries saw periods of political instability and outright conflict in Mali, with Timbuktu often caught in the crosshairs. The most acute threat emerged in 2012 when militant extremist groups linked to Al-Qaeda seized control of the city. These groups, espousing a rigid and destructive ideology, viewed the manuscripts not as a heritage to be preserved, but as a potential threat to their authority, a repository of diverse, liberal, and mystical Islamic interpretations that contradicted their own. There were widespread fears of a repeat of the Taliban's destruction of the Buddhas of Bamiyan, a systematic burning of Timbuktu's literary soul. In that moment of crisis, an incredible clandestine rescue operation was launched. Led by the city's librarians and assisted by a network of citizens, thousands of the most precious manuscripts were smuggled out of Timbuktu under the noses of the occupying forces. The metal chests containing the texts were hidden in everyday objects, transported in vegetable carts, and shipped down the Niger River to the relative safety of the capital, Bamako, in a daring effort that saved an estimated 90% of the known major collections from immediate destruction. Today, the story of Timbuktu's libraries is one of fragile hope and ongoing struggle. The manuscripts that were rescued now face a new challenge. The harsh climate of Bamako, which is far more humid than the arid air of the Sahara, has accelerated their deterioration. An international coalition of archivists, non-profit organizations, and local custodians is now engaged in a monumental preservation project. They are working to digitize the manuscripts page by page, creating a permanent digital record accessible to the world, while also conserving the physical originals in acid-free boxes within climate-controlled rooms. This modern-day scriptorium is a race against a different kind of clock, one where technology is being used to combat the very decay that technology cannot always stop. The legacy of Timbuktu stands as a powerful testament to a different model of knowledge, one that was personal, community-based, and deeply resilient. Its near loss reminds us that the greatest threat to our shared history is not always a single, spectacular blaze, but often the slow, quiet neglect that allows a civilization's memory to simply crumble away, page by precious page, into the waiting dust. But for all the vastness of the royal libraries in Alexandria and the sprawling university collections of Nalanda, some of the most fascinating repositories of ancient knowledge were those designed for a singular, sacred purpose. Tucked away within the sun-scorched walls of an Egyptian temple, far from the bustling centers of trade and political power, lies the story of a library so specialized it was literally built into the fabric of its sanctuary. This is the library of the Temple of Edfu, one of the best preserved ancient cult centers in all of Egypt, and within its sacred precincts, we find a room that served as the definitive reference library for the temple's entire operation. Unlike the universal ambitions of Alexandria, the library at Edfu was a highly focused, practical collection, a working archive that held the divine instructions for maintaining cosmic order itself. The library itself was a specific chamber known in ancient Egyptian as the House of the Book, and its function was absolutely vital to the temple's daily life. Imagine the priests of Edfu, servants of the falcon god Horus, moving through the temple's dimly lit columned halls. Their every action, from the grandest festival to the smallest daily offering, was governed by strict ritual protocol. The library was their indispensable guide, a sacred toolbox containing ritual manuals that detailed the precise words to chant, the exact gestures to make, and the correct offerings to present to the gods. It held liturgical texts for major festivals, like the annual coronation ceremony of the sacred statue of Horus, and magical spells intended to protect the temple and its inhabitants from chaotic forces. But its contents were even more practical than that. The library also stored the temple's own architectural plans and foundational deeds, the very documents that recorded how the building was constructed and the lands it owned. This was not a place for public reading or philosophical debate. It was a secure, holy vault where the professional knowledge required to interface with the divine was meticulously preserved and accessed only by the initiated priesthood. What makes the Library of Edfu truly extraordinary is that we know exactly what was inside it, not because we found the scrolls, but because the priests literally wrote the catalogue on the walls. The inner walls of the library chamber are covered from floor to ceiling with intricate hieroglyphic inscriptions, and these are not random religious scenes. They are a detailed, systematic inventory of the library's holdings. We can read the titles of the books held within, organized by subject. The inscriptions list works like the specifications of the Mansion of the God, which detailed the temple's architecture, and the Book of the Temple, a comprehensive guide to the organization, duties, and rituals of the priesthood. There were texts on astronomy used for calculating the timing of festivals, and medical treatises for treating ailments. This stone catalogue is a breathtaking window into the mind of an ancient institution, a permanent record of its intellectual priorities. It reveals a society where knowledge was power, but a very specific kind of power. The power to correctly perform the rituals that kept the universe functioning in harmony, preventing the world from slipping back into the primordial chaos from which it was born. The ultimate fate of the Library of Edfu, however, was one of quiet desertion rather than violent conquest, as Egypt's ancient religion gradually waned under the successive influences of Greek, Roman, and later Christian rule. The great temple complexes lost their economic support and cultural relevance. The Temple of Edfu, once a vibrant heart of a community, was slowly abandoned. The sands of the desert, always waiting at the edges of the Nile Valley, began their inexorable advance. Without priests to maintain the buildings and clear the drifts, the desert sands patiently filled the courtyards, buried the towering pylons, and seeped into the library chamber itself. The very environment that had preserved Egypt's monuments for millennia by keeping them dry and sheltered from the elements now acted as a gentle shroud, silently entombing the House of the Book and its priceless contents. The papyrus scrolls, once so carefully stored on shelves or in niches, would have decayed in the dampness long before the sand completely took over, leaving the hieroglyphic catalogue on the walls as the only permanent witness to what the room had once contained. When the temple was excavated from its sandy tomb in the 19th century, archaeologists found the library chamber empty of its original texts. The scrolls were gone, returned to the earth. But the stone catalogue remained, a ghostly index pointing to a lost world of specialized knowledge. the loss of the Edfu library is different from the others we have explored. We did not lose the plays of Sophocles or the histories of Assyrian kings here. Instead, we lost the complete working manual for one of the most sophisticated religious institutions of the ancient world. We lost the precise incantations, the detailed understanding of sacred architecture, and the day-to-day records of how a community of priests sustained their relationship with their god for centuries. The library at Edfu reminds us that knowledge comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most profound losses are not of universal wisdom, but of deep, localized expertise, the specific, intricate codes that shaped a civilization's dialogue with the divine, now silenced forever beneath the drifting sands. To truly grasp the intellectual powerhouse that was Alexandria, we must understand that the famous library was just one part of a much larger, more revolutionary complex. The true heart of this academic paradise was the museum, or the institution of the muses, a place that was far more than a simple storage room for scrolls. Think of it not as a library, but as the world's first true research university, a state-funded think tank where the greatest minds of the age were paid a salary by the Ptolemaic kings to simply think, research, and debate. This was a radical concept, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, supported by the vast resources of a kingdom. The museum was a sprawling campus attached to the royal palaces, featuring not only the library's collections but also lush botanical gardens for the study of plants, an astronomical observatory, a menagerie of exotic animals for biological examination, and even a dedicated dining hall where scholars would share their meals and undoubtedly their latest ideas. The scholars who lived and worked within this privileged sanctuary were the rock stars of the ancient intellectual world. This is where Archimedes likely studied and conducted his pioneering experiments in mathematics and physics. It was the home of Eratosthenes, who not only coined the term geography, but also calculated the Earth's circumference with an error of less than 2% by comparing the angles of shadows in two different cities. The physician Herophilus worked here, performing dissections that led him to identify the brain as the seat of intelligence and to distinguish between motor and sensory nerves. And in one of the most stunning intellectual leaps, the astronomer Aristarchus of Samos, from within these very halls, proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, placing the sun at the center nearly 2,000 years before Copernicus. The museum provided the stable, collaborative environment that allowed for such profound, long-term research projects to flourish, creating a concentration of genius that would not be seen again for centuries. While the great library was the repository, the museum was the engine that produced the knowledge to fill it. Its collection, though often overshadowed by the legend of the main library, was itself vast and specialized, likely focusing on the primary research materials and working documents of its resident scholars. This separate collection would have contained their own lecture notes, observational data, preliminary drafts, and specialized treatises that were constantly being refined through debate and experimentation. The destruction of the museum, therefore, was a double tragedy. It wasn't just the loss of stored books, it was the annihilation of an entire ecosystem of innovation. When this institution fell, it wasn't only a warehouse of knowledge that burned, but the very laboratories, the lecture halls, and the collaborative spaces where that knowledge was born. The slow decline and eventual destruction that befell the main library through Caesar's fire, civil unrest, and religious edicts struck the museum with equal force. As the political will and funding dried up, the scholars were dispersed, the gardens withered, and the rooms of groundbreaking discussion fell silent, marking the end of an unprecedented era where a government believed that funding pure research was the ultimate expression of its power and legacy. From the specialized sacred texts of Edfu, we now travel to a library whose magnificent shell has survived the centuries, a structure so beautiful that it reminds us all too painfully of the treasure it once held. In the ancient Roman city of Ephesus on the coast of modern-day Turkey, the Library of Celsus still captures the breath of every visitor who walks its marble-paved street. This was not a royal or state institution, but a spectacular personal monument, built around the year 115 of the Common Era by the Roman consul Gaius Julius Aquila as a heroic tomb and library for his father, the former proconsul Tiberius Julius Celsus Pulminus. The building was a profound statement of filial devotion and Roman civic pride. Its facade, meticulously reconstructed in the 1970s, is a masterpiece of Roman imperial architecture, a two-story screen of columns, niches, and statues that creates an incredible illusion of depth and grandeur. 4 female statues personifying the virtues of Celsus' wisdom, knowledge, intelligence, and valor stand in the niches gazing out over the city, a permanent tribute to the character of the man whose sarcophagus lay directly beneath the main reading hall. Within this architectural jewel lay a collection of immense intellectual value. The library was designed to hold approximately 12,000 scrolls, a substantial and prestigious private collection that would have been the envy of any scholar. The scrolls themselves were housed in a series of recessed niches in the interior walls, a clever architectural feature that protected the delicate papyrus from direct light and humidity fluctuations. These niches were double-walled, creating a hollow space between the inner and outer walls that provided insulation and helped maintain a stable environment for the precious texts. This was a library built with both splendor and practicality in mind, a place where the memory of a great man was honored through the preservation of the very knowledge he championed in life. To stand in its main hall would have been to experience a symphony of order and beauty, surrounded by the collected wisdom of the age, all dedicated to one individual's legacy. Yet today, those niches are empty. The fate of the library's collection is one of history's quiet, unresolved mysteries, with its dispersal likely being a slow unraveling rather than a single catastrophic event. The most prominent theory points to a fire that swept through the city of Ephesus, possibly in the 3rd century. While the library's sturdy marble facade and walls withstood the flames, the interior, with its wooden shelves, beams, and the highly combustible scrolls, would have been utterly consumed. A fire of that nature would have been devastatingly fast and complete, turning 12,000 scrolls into ash in a matter of hours. The hollow walls that were designed to protect the collection would have done little against an inferno raging within the main chamber itself. However, fire is not the only suspect in this historical whodunit. Another compelling theory suggests a slower, more insidious enemy: decay and neglect. As the Roman Empire underwent its long transformation, economic priorities shifted, and the sophisticated infrastructure that maintained public buildings like libraries began to crumble. Ephesus itself, as a major port, was suffering from the silting up of its harbor, which gradually strangled its trade and wealth. Without a dedicated staff and a steady source of funding to maintain the library, the delicate papyrus scrolls would have succumbed to the ravages of time. Insects, moisture, and even the simple brittleness that comes with age would have rendered the collection unusable and eventually worthless in the eyes of a city struggling with more immediate concerns. The scrolls may have simply been cleared out at some point to make way for a different use of the sturdy building. There is also the distinct possibility of deliberate dispersal. In the later Roman and early Byzantine eras, as intellectual centers shifted and the language of scholarship evolved, the Greek and Latin texts of Celsus's library may have been seen as relics of a pagan past. The contents could have been parceled out to other, more active centers of learning, or the scrolls might have been scraped clean and reused as palimpsests, a common practice where old text was washed off expensive parchment to make room for new writing. The very emptiness of the library today is a powerful testament to this gradual erosion of knowledge. Unlike Alexandria, where the destruction was legendary and total, the loss at Ephesus feels more like a slow fading, a collection that simply dwindled away until nothing but its beautiful, silent shell remained. The Library of Celsus thus stands as a different kind of monument, not just to the man it honors, but to the fragile nature of the knowledge it was built to protect, a breathtaking marble casket for a treasure that vanished, leaving behind only the ghost of its former glory and the enduring question of what those 12,000 scrolls might have contained. Yet as magnificent as these marble monuments were, they represented a tradition of shared knowledge, of scholarship meant to endure. But what happens when a civilization's entire written record is deliberately targeted for annihilation? To answer that, we must sail to the southern shores of the Mediterranean, to the legendary city of Carthage. This was the formidable capital of a Phoenician trading empire that grew to challenge Rome itself, a metropolis so wealthy and powerful that its very existence was perceived as an existential threat. And at the heart of this sophisticated civilization were its legendary libraries, repositories that held the secrets to Carthage's unparalleled success. These were not collections of Greek philosophy or dramatic poetry. They were the practical, hard-won archives of a nation of merchants, explorers, and admirals. The libraries of Carthage were said to contain exhaustive records on everything from celestial navigation and seasonal wind patterns to detailed maps of trade routes stretching across the known world, from the tin mines of Britain to the gold-rich coasts of West Africa. They housed meticulous accounts of agricultural techniques, enabling the city to thrive in its North African environment, and perhaps most importantly, they contained the entire written history of the Carthaginian people themselves, their foundation myths, their treaties, and the chronicles of their leaders. This vast reservoir of specialized knowledge was what made Carthage such a formidable rival. It represented centuries of accumulated experience, a corporate intelligence that guided its ships, managed its economy, and informed its statecraft. The famous Carthaginian navigator Hanno's account of his voyage down the African coast, a text that was likely housed in these libraries, described encounters with gorillas and volcanic eruptions, a testament to the far-reaching exploration the city sponsored. To possess these libraries was to possess the operational manual for an entire maritime empire. Yet this very strength sealed their doom. The Roman Republic, after decades of brutal conflict in the Punic Wars, finally achieved total victory in the year 146 before the Common Era. After a grueling 3-year siege, the Roman legions under Scipio Aemilianus broke through the city's defenses. What followed was not merely a military conquest, it was an act of cultural erasure so complete it has few parallels in history. The orders from the Roman Senate were stark and unequivocal. Carthage was to be utterly destroyed. For 10 days, the Roman soldiers systematically burned, looted, and razed the city. The libraries, as the core of Carthaginian identity and capability, were a primary target. The countless scrolls and records, written on papyrus and parchment in the Phoenician language, were torn from their shelves and thrown into the raging fires. The Roman historian Polybius, who was present with Scipio's army, recorded the scene, noting the utter desperation of the Carthaginians as they saw their entire world consumed by flames. This was not an accidental byproduct of war like the fire in Alexandria's harbor. This was a calculated, deliberate policy of damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory. The Romans were determined to ensure that Carthage could never rise again, not just as a political or military power, but as a cultural entity. By destroying its written records, they sought to sever the Carthaginians from their own history, to obliterate their knowledge base, and to erase their very story from the earth. They even famously sowed the fields with salt, a symbolic act to sterilize the land. But the burning of the libraries was the sterilization of its memory. The consequence of this deliberate obliteration is staggering. Today, we know the Carthaginian perspective almost entirely through the filter of their Greek and Roman enemies. We have no Carthaginian history written by a Carthaginian. We have no first-hand accounts of their government, their religious beliefs in their own words, or their vast geographical knowledge. The plays, the poems, the merchant logs, the architectural manuals, all of it is gone. The few fragments of Carthaginian writing that survive are mostly short inscriptions on tombstones or votive markers, giving us only the faintest whisper of their language and culture. We are left to piece together the story of one of the ancient world's greatest empires from archaeological artifacts and the often biased second-hand accounts of those who hated them most. The burning of the libraries of Carthage stands as one of history's most chilling examples of how victors can rewrite the narrative by simply destroying all other versions. It created a black hole in our historical record, a profound silence where an entire civilization's voice once spoke, a permanent reminder that knowledge is not just fragile, it is a primary target in the quest for total dominance. In the shadow of the legendary Royal Library, a second great beacon of knowledge shone in Alexandria, a sanctuary that may have outlasted its famous parent. This was the Library of the Serapeum, often called the Daughter Library, and its story is one of both continuity and a uniquely brutal end. While the main library was part of the Royal Bruchaean district, the Serapeum was housed within the magnificent Temple of Serapis, a sprawling complex that served as the city's most important religious center for the Greco-Egyptian population. Its creation is often attributed to Ptolemy II or III, and scholars debate its precise relationship to the main library. Some suggest it was a supplementary public annex designed to make a portion of the city's vast collection more accessible to scholars who were not part of the elite museum. Others propose it held a duplicate set of the most important scrolls, acting as a sacred backup for the primary collection, or that it specialized in works that were more religious or popular in nature. Whatever its original function, the Serapeum evolved into a major intellectual and spiritual hub in its own right. Its colonnaded halls filled with the murmur of philosophical debate just steps from the inner sanctum where the god Serapis was worshipped. The Serapeum's potential for a longer life is a key part of its tragic appeal. While the main library in the Bruchaean quarter suffered repeated blows from Caesar's fire in 48 before the Common Era and later during the turbulent 3rd century, the Temple Library, situated in a different part of the city, may have been spared the worst of these early devastations. As the royal palace district fell into decline and disrepair, the Temple of Serapis, supported by the enduring faith of the people, likely remained a vibrant center. This has led to the compelling theory that the Serapeum effectively became the successor to the Great Library, inheriting its role as Alexandria's premier repository of knowledge long after the original institution had faded. Scholars and students would have continued to frequent its halls, studying its scrolls even as the political and economic landscape of the Roman Empire shifted around them. For a time, it seemed this sacred library might endure where the royal one could not, preserving the flame of classical learning within the protective walls of a temple. This fragile survival, however, collided violently with the rising tide of a new religious order in the late 4th century. By the 380s, Christianity had become the official state religion of the Roman Empire, and zealous figures were determined to purge the ancient world of its pagan past. In Alexandria, this fervor was embodied by the Patriarch Theophilus, a powerful and uncompromising leader. In the year 391, he received official permission from the Emperor Theodosius I to destroy the city's pagan temples. Theophilus immediately targeted the Serapeum, the grandest and most symbolic stronghold of the old faith in all of Egypt. What followed was not a scholarly debate or a quiet confiscation, but a full-scale military assault. Theophilus led a mob of fanatical followers backed by imperial soldiers in a direct attack on the temple complex. They were met with fierce, if ultimately futile, resistance from pagan defenders who had barricaded themselves inside, believing their sacred god would miraculously protect his home. The destruction was methodical and absolute. The Christian mob stormed the temple, smashing the colossal cult statue of Serapis, a magnificent chryselephantine figure of gold and ivory, into pieces before dragging its remnants through the streets to be burned. They systematically defaced the religious imagery and tore down the architectural splendor that had defined the site for centuries. And at the heart of this orgy of iconoclasm was the fate of the library. The scrolls housed within the Serapeum, representing centuries of accumulated pagan wisdom, science, and literature, were deemed heretical and dangerous. Historical accounts, particularly from the Christian historian Socrates of Constantinople, describe the library's contents being looted and publicly burned or simply scattered and destroyed. The temple itself was razed to its foundations, and a Christian church was erected on the spot, a physical assertion of theological victory. The annihilation of the Serapeum was far more definitive than the slow decline of the main library. It was a single, decisive act of ideological purification, a deliberate and public execution of a knowledge system that a new authority had judged obsolete and threatening. With its destruction, the last great institutional holder of Alexandria's classical legacy was extinguished, marking the final, irrevocable end of the city's golden age of learning and cementing the Serapeum's place in history as the last breath of a world that was being forcefully forgotten. Yet as we consider these vast imperial and religious collections, we must turn to a library of a profoundly different nature, one that was not built by kings or housed in temples, but one that was, in many ways, the intellectual seed from which so many of these great institutions grew. This is the story of the personal library of Aristotle, the philosopher whose ideas would shape Western thought for 2 millennia. His library was not a public treasure but a working tool, the private collection of a mind that sought to systematize all of human knowledge. Imagine the shelves in his study in Athens, lined with scrolls that represented a revolutionary range of subjects. There would have been his own groundbreaking manuscripts, drafts of works like the Physics, the Metaphysics, and the Nicomachean Ethics, texts that were themselves the product of a lifetime of observation, debate, and relentless inquiry. But his collection was far more than just his own writings. It was a research library assembled over a lifetime, filled with the works of earlier philosophers like Plato, from whom he famously diverged, along with texts on biology from his dissections of marine life, political constitutions from the various Greek city-states, and historical accounts gathered from his travels. This library was the engine room of the Lyceum, his school in Athens, the vital resource that fueled the peripatetic tradition of walking and talking through complex problems. The fate of this priceless collection after Aristotle's death in 322 before the Common Era is a historical mystery that has tantalized scholars for centuries. According to the geographer Strabo and the historian Plutarch, the library did not remain in Athens. Instead, it was inherited by Aristotle's chosen successor, Theophrastus, who continued to add to it, enlarging the collection with his own extensive botanical and philosophical works. Upon Theophrastus's death, the library was bequeathed to his own pupil, a man named Neleus, who came from the city of Sepsis in Asia Minor. This is where the trail begins to go cold and the theories begin to multiply. Neleus, it is said, decided to take the entire collection back to his hometown, possibly to protect it from the turbulent political climate in Athens or from the rival kings who were known to be voraciously collecting books for their own libraries, like the Ptolemies in Alexandria. The most compelling and romantic theory suggests that Neleus's heirs, perhaps lacking his scholarly devotion or facing financial pressure, did not know what to do with this immense intellectual inheritance. The story goes that they hid the entire collection in a cellar or a cave to keep it safe from the acquisitive hands of the Attalid kings of Pergamum, who were actively scouring the region for scrolls to fill their great library. There, in that subterranean hiding place, this foundational library of Western philosophy supposedly languished for generations, vulnerable to the damp, insects, and the slow, inexorable decay that preys on papyrus. Later owners, the story continues, discovered the moldering scrolls but, tragically unaware of their value, used them for kindling or sold them off in bits and pieces. This narrative paints an almost unbearable picture of neglect, the very bedrock of logical and scientific thought slowly crumbling into dust in a forgotten hole in the ground. A far more dramatic theory posits that the collection met a violent end, perhaps destroyed in one of the many wars or fires that ravaged the cities of the ancient world. Yet another fascinating possibility offers a more hopeful, albeit still tragic, twist. Some ancient sources, including the writer Athenaeus, hint that a substantial portion of Aristotle's library was eventually purchased by the Ptolemaic dynasty and transported to Alexandria to form the very core of the great library's legendary collection. The poetic symmetry of this idea is profound, the greatest library of the ancient world being built upon the personal collection of its greatest thinker. If true, it would mean that Aristotle's works we have today, which are often just his esoteric lecture notes and not his polished published dialogues, survived only because they were copied from the originals held in Alexandria. It would mean that the loss of the Library of Alexandria was, in a very real sense, also the final, complete loss of Aristotle's own library, its foundational texts consumed in the same flames that erased so much else. The true tragedy of losing Aristotle's personal library is not merely the loss of the original texts of his published works, which were praised in antiquity for their literary beauty, but the loss of the entire research context. We would give anything to see the marginal notes in his own hand, the annotations he made in his copy of Plato's Republic, the maps and diagrams that accompanied his biological studies, and the raw data from which he constructed his theories of politics and physics. This was not just a static collection of books, it was a dynamic record of a mind at work, a map of the intellectual journey that led to the creation of entire fields of study. Its disappearance represents a chasm in our understanding of how Aristotle's thought evolved, leaving us with the magnificent skeleton of his ideas, but without the living, breathing process that gave them life. The mystery of its fate is a haunting echo of the man himself, a profound presence whose full dimensions we can only ever partially grasp, a foundational voice whose original tone and timbre have been forever silenced by the passage of time. Yet as one great library after another fell in the old world, an equally devastating and deliberate eradication of knowledge was unfolding across the Atlantic Ocean, in the lush rainforests and soaring stone cities of the Maya. Here, a literary tradition flourished in splendid isolation, creating books of a form and substance unlike anything seen in Europe or Asia. The Maya did not write on papyrus scrolls or clay tablets. They created codices or screenfold books made from the soft inner bark of the wild fig tree. This bark was pounded thin and coated with a fine layer of white lime plaster, creating a smooth, brilliant white surface upon which teams of scribes, working with fine brushes and richly colored inks derived from minerals and plants, would paint their intricate glyphs and illustrations. A single codex could unfold like an accordion to stretch over 20 feet long, a continuous tapestry of knowledge that was both a scientific manual and a sacred text. The intellectual achievement contained within these bark paper books was nothing short of astronomical. The Maya were arguably the most accomplished astronomers and mathematicians of the ancient world, and their codices were the repositories of this profound wisdom. They contained incredibly precise charts tracking the movements of Venus, Mars, and other planets, with tables predicting eclipses and celestial events centuries into the future with an accuracy that European science of the same period could not match. Their mathematical system, based on the concept of zero, a revolutionary abstract idea they developed independently, allowed them to calculate cycles of time spanning millions of years. These codices were not just observational records, they were complex computational devices filled with hieroglyphic tables that priests and scholars used to calibrate their sacred calendar, an interlocking system of cycles that governed the rhythm of ritual and agriculture. Beyond the stars and numbers, these books also held the very history and mythology of the Maya people. The genealogies of kings, the records of great battles, the stories of their gods, and the complex rituals needed to maintain the balance of the cosmos. This entire universe of indigenous American thought was systematically targeted for annihilation in the 16th century, when Spanish conquistadors and, most significantly, Catholic clergy arrived in the Yucatan Peninsula. They encountered a civilization whose spiritual life was inextricably linked to its written word. To the Maya, the codices were vessels of divine communication. To the Franciscan friars, they were the devil's scripture. Leading this crusade against native knowledge was a man whose name has become synonymous with this cultural catastrophe, Friar Diego de Landa. A complex and fervent figure, Landa was initially tasked with converting the Maya to Christianity, but his mission warped into an obsessive campaign to extinguish their entire cultural identity. In July of 1562, in the town of Mani, he orchestrated a massive auto-da-fe, a public spectacle of penitence and destruction. He gathered every Maya codex and hieroglyphic inscription he could find, piling them into a giant pyramid of knowledge and set them ablaze. In a single, terrifying act, he incinerated thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, an entire library of a civilization going up in smoke. The justification Landa offered in his own later writings, Relación de los Cosas de Yucatán, was chilling in its certainty. He declared that the codices contained superstition and lies of the devil, and that seeing how they preoccupied the Maya, he burned them all, a decision he claimed the locals regretted deeply and which caused them great grief. The tragedy is compounded by a bitter irony. In that very same book, Landa took pains to record detailed notes on the Maya calendar, their writing system, and their social customs. Information he effectively preserved even as he destroyed the original sources. He became one of our primary informants about a culture he himself had worked so hard to obliterate. The scale of the loss is almost incomprehensible. Of the untold thousands of codices that once existed in temple libraries and royal courts across the Maya world, only 4 are confirmed to have survived the Spanish conquest, likely because they were smuggled out and hidden by Maya communities or were sent to Europe as curiosities before the full force of the Inquisition took hold. These 4, the Madrid, Dresden, Paris, and Grolier codices, are mere fragments, tantalizing glimpses of a vast intellectual continent that now lies almost entirely beneath the waves of history. The burning of the Maya libraries represents a loss of a different order. We did not just lose the equivalent of Mayan plays or poems, we lost the operational manual for an entire way of perceiving time, the cosmos, and humanity's place within it. We lost their own detailed histories written in their own voice. Because of this, key aspects of Maya civilization, particularly the causes of the mysterious collapse of their classic period cities, remain hotly debated enigmas. The few codices that survived, along with the inscriptions carved on stone monuments, have allowed modern scholars to painstakingly decipher the Maya script, a process that has only borne fruit in recent decades. But the ghost libraries, the ones that turn to ash in Mani, haunt this field of study. Every new translation from a surviving text only highlights the vastness of what is gone. The story of the Maya codices is a stark lesson in the violence of cultural imperialism, a reminder that the quest to erase a people's memory can be as destructive as any military conquest, leaving behind a silence so profound that we are still, centuries later, straining to hear the echoes of what was lost. While the Mediterranean world was building its great libraries of papyrus and parchment on the other side of the globe, an empire of equal sophistication was undertaking a literary project of staggering ambition. In ancient China, the Han Dynasty, which ruled for 4 centuries from around 206 before the Common Era, recognized that the stability of their vast empire depended not just on military might, but on the mastery of its own history and philosophy. This led to the creation of a state-sponsored intellectual endeavor that would become the Imperial Library of the Han, an institution designed to collect, standardize, and preserve the entire written heritage of Chinese civilization. The physical form of this knowledge, however, was profoundly different from the scrolls of the West. The primary writing materials were bamboo slips, narrow slats of bamboo that were strung together with cords to form flexible pages, and rolls of luxurious silk, which were reserved for the most important texts due to their high cost. A single scholarly work could be a substantial physical object composed of hundreds of these heavy bamboo bundles, requiring carts for transport and vast, organized spaces for storage. The driving force behind this monumental effort was more than academic. It was a mission of recovery and reconciliation. The Han dynasty rose to power following the short-lived but brutally efficient Qin dynasty, whose first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, had enacted one of history's most infamous campaigns against knowledge itself. Around 213 before the Common Era, acting on the advice of his legalist minister Lai Si, the emperor issued a decree that all books of history, philosophy, and poetry, with the exception of practical manuals on medicine, agriculture, and divination, were to be confiscated and burned. His goal was to erase the competing intellectual traditions of the past, particularly Confucianism, and to silence the scholars who used historical precedent to criticize his autocratic rule. The stories tell of massive bonfires of bamboo slips, the destruction of entire schools of thought, and the live burial of hundreds of Confucian scholars who dared to resist. This cultural holocaust created a desperate need for the Han emperors to reassemble their own history, sending scholars across the land to find hidden texts, record oral traditions from elderly masters, and painstakingly reconstruct the classics that had been nearly wiped out. Under this directive, the Han Imperial Library grew into an unparalleled center of scholarship. The most significant contribution came from the polymath Liu Xiang and his son Liu Xin, who were commissioned by the emperor to undertake the first comprehensive catalogue of the library's holdings. Their work, The Seven Summaries, was a breathtaking intellectual achievement. They didn't just list titles, they systematically categorized every known text into 7 major divisions: the classics, philosophy, poetry, military strategy, mathematics, and medicine, and wrote critical commentaries on each one, evaluating their authenticity and provenance. This was the world's first known analytic bibliography, a sophisticated system of knowledge organization that predated similar efforts in the West by centuries. The library's collection swelled to include tens of thousands of bundles of bamboo slips and silk scrolls, housing everything from the foundational Confucian texts like the Analects and the 5 classics to historical records, astronomical charts, and poetic anthologies that define the Chinese literary tradition. Yet, despite its grandeur and systematic approach, the Han Imperial Library was perpetually vulnerable. The very political instability that it sought to mitigate through knowledge eventually consumed it. As the Han dynasty began its long decline in the 2nd century of the Common Era, the empire was torn apart by factional court intrigues, popular rebellions like the Yellow Turban Uprising, and the rising power of warlords. During these periods of chaos, the capital cities were repeatedly sacked. The library, as a symbol of imperial authority and a storehouse of state memory, was a prime target. While no single event carries the dramatic weight of Qin Shi Huang's burning, the historical records indicate that the library suffered catastrophic and repeated losses during these uprisings. Precious bamboo and silk manuscripts were destroyed in the fires that consumed palace complexes, looted by soldiers for their valuable containers, or simply scattered and lost as the imperial administration collapsed. Each sack represented another irreversible erosion of the recovered knowledge, a second burning that undid much of the painstaking work of the Han scholars. The legacy of the Han Library, therefore, is one of profound paradox. It was born from the ashes of one of history's greatest book burnings, a testament to the human spirit's drive to reclaim its past. It developed a system of knowledge classification that would influence Chinese bureaucracy and scholarship for 2 millennia. Yet, its own contents were ultimately consumed by the very cycles of violence it was meant to help the empire transcend. The texts we have today, the Chinese classics that have been passed down through the ages, exist only because of copies that were made and distributed beyond the walls of the Imperial Library, preserved by private scholars and local schools. The Han Imperial Library stands not as a physical repository we can excavate, but as a powerful idea, a fleeting moment when a civilization, recognizing the fragility of its own memory, built a fortress for its words, only to learn that no fortress can ultimately withstand the relentless tide of history. High above the bustling Athenian agora, on the sun-drenched plateau of the Acropolis, stood not only the iconic temples to the gods, but also the heart of the city's intellectual life. While we rightly marvel at the Parthenon's majestic columns, we must also imagine the quieter structures that housed a different kind of tribute to human achievement, the libraries of the Acropolis. These were not one single, massive institution, but a collection of both public repositories and private collections, likely housed in the grand stoas, the long, colonnaded walkways that offered shade and space for conversation, and within the treasuries and dedicated buildings that crowded the sacred rock. Here, in the very shadow of the temple of Athena, the goddess of wisdom herself, the Athenians stored the physical manifestations of their genius, the scrolls that contained the radical new ideas that would shape the entire Western world. The contents of these collections would have been a breathtaking assembly of the nascent Western canon. Picture shelves filled with the official state copies of the great tragic plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, their papyrus rolls containing the very texts performed during the city Dionysia festival, preserving the complex emotions and moral quandaries that defined Athenian identity. Alongside them would be the biting, hilarious comedies of Aristophanes, offering a satirical mirror to the city's political life and social foibles. But beyond the drama, the Acropolis libraries would have held the foundational texts of history and governance. The scrolls of Herodotus, with his inquiries into the Greco-Persian wars, and Thucydides, with his brutally analytical account of the Peloponnesian War, provided the Athenians with a sense of their own past and the harsh realities of power. Most critically, this was the living archive of democracy itself. It would have stored the original decrees passed by the assembly, the legal speeches written by orators like Demosthenes, and the constitutional documents that outlined the world's first democratic system, making the Acropolis not just a religious center, but the central filing cabinet for the Athenian experiment in self-rule. This unparalleled repository of political and cultural memory faced its first great trial in the year 480 before the Common Era, when the massive invading army of the Persian king Xerxes descended upon Attica. Unable to defend the city in open battle, the Athenians made the painful decision to evacuate, abandoning their homes and their sacred Acropolis to the enemy. The Persians, in a calculated act of psychological and cultural annihilation, breached the defenses, looted the temples and treasuries, and then set the entire Acropolis complex ablaze. The fire would have been catastrophic, consuming the wooden shelves and beams that housed the city's earliest literary and political records, while the great stone temples were later rebuilt with even greater glory in the Periclean age. The loss of those early archives was irrevocable. The written history of Athens's archaic period, its earliest poetry, and the initial records of its fledgling democracy were largely wiped out, forcing later historians to rely on fragmentary inscriptions and oral traditions to piece together the city's formative years. Despite this devastating blow, Athens recovered and its intellectual life entered a new golden age. The Acropolis was rebuilt, and with it, new libraries and collections would have been established. The philosophical schools of Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum flourished in the city's groves, and it is almost certain that copies of their foundational works, or the works that influenced them, found a home on the Acropolis as part of the city's official cultural patrimony. For centuries, this restored hub of knowledge endured, a symbol of Athenian resilience. However, the final, decisive blow to this ancient intellectual heart came from a new Mediterranean power, Rome. In 86 before the Common Era, the Roman general Lucius Cornelius Sulla, in a brutal punitive campaign, laid siege to Athens, which had allied with a rival king. Sulla's legions stormed the city, and his troops, infamous for their lack of cultural sentiment, unleashed a wave of destruction. They sacked the Acropolis with a thoroughness that even the Persians had not matched, looting its art and treasures to fund Sulla's military campaigns back in Italy. Any libraries that had been rebuilt and replenished over the preceding centuries would have been prime targets for plunder. Precious scrolls, seen as valuable commodities, were likely packed up and shipped to Rome to adorn the private villas of the emerging Roman aristocracy, while others were undoubtedly destroyed in the associated fires or simply scattered and lost in the chaos of the sack. The loss of the Acropolis libraries is a tragedy that resonates on a deeply personal level. We think of the plays of Aeschylus. We have 7 of his estimated 70 to 90 works. The rest perished, their titles known only from passing references by other authors. The same is true for Sophocles and Euripides. The masterpieces we study today are but a small fraction of their total output, a curated survival that represents an immense ocean of lost creativity. Beyond drama, we lost the complete historical works of other early chroniclers, the full legal arguments of forgotten orators, and the intimate records of daily political life that would have given us an unfiltered view of how democracy truly functioned on the ground. The sack by Sulla did not just rob Athens of its physical wealth, it effectively cut the direct, curated link between the city and its own intellectual origins. The libraries of the Acropolis were the definitive, authorized memory of the Athenian people, and their dispersal and destruction meant that the story of classical Athens would forever after have to be pieced together from copies held elsewhere, from quotations in later texts, and from the silent, enduring testimony of stone. Their fate is a powerful reminder that the pillars of wisdom can be just as fragile as the temples that house them when confronted with the unthinking force of conquest. Far to the south of the Mediterranean world, where the trade routes from the interior of Africa met the shipping lanes of the Red Sea, rose a kingdom so powerful it fashioned its own currency, erected monumental obelisks taller than any in Egypt, and was counted by the Persian prophet Mani as one of the 4 great empires of the world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. This was the kingdom of Axum, in the highlands of what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea. From its bustling port of Adulis, a constant flow of ivory, frankincense, gold, and exotic animals moved to markets across the ancient world, financing a sophisticated and literate civilization. And at the heart of Axum's cultural and spiritual identity was a literary tradition centered around the Ge'ez language, a tradition that almost certainly gave rise to royal and ecclesiastical libraries whose loss has left a profound gap in the history of an entire continent. The conversion of Axum to Christianity in the 4th century under King Azana was a transformative event, aligning the kingdom with the spiritual currents of the Eastern Roman Empire and creating an urgent need for a new body of sacred literature. This spurred a monumental project of translation and original composition. Monastic scribes working in scriptoriums attached to great churches like the Cathedral of Our Lady Mary of Zion began the painstaking work of translating the Bible from Greek and possibly Syriac into Ge'ez. But their ambition went far beyond simply creating a prayer book. They produced a rich corpus of texts that would have filled the shelves of Axumite libraries, intricate theological commentaries, vibrant hagiographies of saints, detailed historical chronicles of the Solomonic dynasty, which traced its lineage back to the union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and comprehensive legal codes that governed this sophisticated Christian state. These were not mere copies of foreign works. They were dynamic, living documents that adapted Christian thought to a uniquely African context, creating a theological and historical voice that was entirely their own. The physical form of these libraries would have been both familiar and alien to a scholar from Rome or Constantinople. The primary writing material was parchment, much like in Pergamum, but the books themselves were codices, bound volumes that were rapidly becoming the standard in the Christian world for their durability and ease of reference. The most prized of these were likely the illuminated manuscripts, where the Ge'ez script, with its elegant and distinctive alpha syllabary, was intertwined with vibrant illustrations depicting biblical scenes and Aksumite kings, all painted with pigments derived from local minerals and plants. These collections were likely housed in two key locations, within the secure chambers of the royal treasury, safeguarding the kingdom's official histories and administrative records, and deep within the protective walls of remote rock-hewn monasteries, where monks dedicated their lives to both preserving and expanding this sacred knowledge. These monastic libraries became fortresses of faith and learning, isolated from the political turmoil of the capital but deeply connected to the spiritual life of the kingdom. The disappearance of these libraries is a story not of a single dramatic fire, but of a slow, crushing decline driven by a perfect storm of environmental, economic, and political factors. From the 7th century onwards, Aksum's fortunes began to wane. The rise and rapid expansion of Islam fundamentally reshaped the geopolitical landscape, severing Aksum's centuries-old trade networks across the Red Sea and isolating the Christian kingdom from its coreligionists in the Byzantine Empire. As their economic lifeline was cut, the Aksumite state lost the wealth required to maintain its monumental infrastructure and support its scholarly class. This external pressure was compounded by a terrifying internal shift. Evidence from soil cores and climate data suggests the region was hit by a prolonged and severe drought, perhaps exacerbated by overfarming. The very environment that had sustained Aksum's agricultural surplus began to fail, leading to food shortages, depopulation, and a gradual abandonment of the grand capital itself. In this atmosphere of slow-motion collapse, the great libraries were left profoundly vulnerable. Without a wealthy monarchy to fund the scribes and without a stable, urban population to support the monasteries, the meticulous work of preservation ground to a halt. The parchment codices, once so carefully copied and illuminated, now faced relentless enemies. In the damp highland climate, mold and moisture would have been a constant threat, slowly causing the pages to stick together and the ink to fade. Insects, particularly the ubiquitous termite, could reduce a priceless codex to a pile of dust in a matter of years. As political power shifted and the center of Ethiopian civilization moved further south, these repositories were simply forgotten, their locations lost as the great stone buildings of Aksum were reclaimed by the earth and the jungle. Unlike the deliberate burnings in Alexandria or Timbuktu, this was a death by 1,000 cuts, a tragedy of quiet decay where the collective memory of a kingdom slowly disintegrated in the silence of abandoned stone rooms. Yet the story does not end in total loss. The legacy of the Aksumite libraries lived on in a remarkable and fragile thread of continuity. The Ge'ez literary tradition, though battered, was never completely extinguished. In the isolated, high-walled monasteries that dotted the Ethiopian landscape, such as those on the islands of Lake Tana, dedicated monks continued their scribble work through the centuries, often recopying texts from older, deteriorating Aksumite manuscripts onto new parchment. It is largely thanks to this unbroken, if tenuous, chain of transmission that we have any of the great Ge'ez texts today, such as the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings, which elaborates on the Solomonic lineage of the Ethiopian monarchy. However, the loss of the original Aksumite collections means we possess only a filtered, later version of their history. We lost the foundational documents, the first drafts of their national story, the unedited chronicles that would have given us a clear window into the worldview of Africa's most powerful ancient Christian kingdom. The silence of the lost libraries of Aksum is a poignant reminder that knowledge can fade not only in the roar of the flame, but in the quiet, relentless advance of the desert and the vine. But as one great empire fell in the west, another rose in the east to become a formidable custodian of knowledge. a flame that burned brightly until it was violently extinguished by the winds of conquest. Journey with us now to the arid plains of ancient Persia, to the glittering capital of the Sasanian Empire, where scholars and scribes built a legendary institution known as the House of Knowledge, or the Des-i-Nipisht. This was not merely a library in the sense we have come to understand. It was the central intellectual engine of a civilization that saw itself as the heir to a glorious past and the defender of a divine truth against the rising powers of Rome and later the armies of Byzantium. Established at the very heart of the empire, likely within the monumental capital of Ctesiphon, the Des-i-Nipisht was a state-sponsored project of breathtaking ambition, designed to consolidate all the wisdom relevant to running a vast multicultural empire and to preserve the sacred core of the Zoroastrian faith. The collection housed within its walls was a profound reflection of Sasanian identity, a blend of deep religious tradition and voracious intellectual curiosity. At its spiritual core were the Avestan texts, the holy scriptures of Zoroastrianism. This included the original Gathas, the hymns attributed to the prophet Zarathustra himself, along with extensive commentaries and theological works known as the Zen. Preserving these texts was considered a sacred duty for the Sasanian kings, who saw themselves as champions of the faith, but the library's scope reached far beyond the liturgical. The Sassanids were brilliant synthesizers of knowledge, actively sponsoring the translation of scientific and philosophical works from Greek, Syriac, and Sanskrit. It was here, in the Des-i-Nipisht, that the complex astronomical and mathematical theories of Indian scholars were studied, and where Greek medical texts, particularly those of Galen and Hippocrates, were translated into Pahlavi, the Middle Persian language. This created a unique fusion of ideas, where Zoroastrian cosmology met Greek logic and Indian numerals, fostering an environment of scholarship that would later profoundly influence the Islamic Golden Age. This great repository of Persian and global thought, however, faced an existential threat with the explosive expansion of the Rashidun Caliphate in the 7th century. The final, devastating blow came after the pivotal Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in 636, a defeat that shattered the main Sasanian army and opened the heart of the empire to invasion. As the Arab forces advanced, they captured Ctesiphon, and historical accounts from later Persian and Arab historians tell a story of cultural cataclysm. The commander of the conquering army, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, reportedly wrote to the Caliph Umar in Medina, asking what should be done with the immense collection of books found in the royal treasury. The Caliph's reply, as the story goes, has echoed through the centuries as a symbol of devastating loss. He is said to have reasoned that if the books contained what was in the Quran, they were redundant, and if they contained anything that contradicted it, they were heretical. His instruction was chillingly simple: destroy them all. The methods of this destruction are described in varying, equally horrifying details. Some accounts claim the priceless manuscripts were used as fuel to heat the bathhouses of the occupying army for an astonishing 6 months. Others say they were simply thrown into the rivers and canals, their ink washing away until the waters ran black, obliterating the words in a torrential flood of ignorance. While modern historians debate the literal accuracy of these specific narratives, seeing them as potentially layered with later political and religious symbolism, the archaeological and historical consensus is undeniable. The Des-i-Nipisht was systematically obliterated. The conquest was not just a military takeover, it was a campaign of cultural and religious restructuring. The Zoroastrian religion, along with its priestly class and its textual foundations, was the primary pillar of Sasanian identity and resistance. Destroying its central library was a deliberate act to break that pillar, to dismantle the administrative and intellectual framework of the old regime, and to accelerate the Islamization of Persia. The loss of the House of Knowledge was more than the burning of buildings, it was the silencing of a unique philosophical voice. We lost the bulk of the original Zoroastrian Middle Persian literature, including detailed histories of the Sasanian kings, intricate philosophical debates, and vast swaths of the Zen commentaries that would have given us a much deeper understanding of one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions. We lost the Sasanian translations of Greek and Indian works, which represented a critical link in the chain of transmission between antiquity and the medieval world. The tragic fate of the Desi-Nipisht created a black hole in Persian history, forcing scholars to rely on later, often hostile, sources to reconstruct the worldview of an empire that had rivaled Rome for centuries. Its destruction stands as one of the most decisive and consequential losses in our story, a moment where a vast continent of knowledge was submerged, leaving only scattered islands behind and irrevocably altering the intellectual landscape of the world. Yet even as the great Desi-Nipisht fell, another beacon of Sasanian learning shone with a different, more resilient light. Nestled in the southwestern province of Khuzestan, the Academy of Gondishapur stood as one of the most enduring and cosmopolitan intellectual hubs of the ancient world. Founded in the 3rd century, possibly by the Sasanian king Shapur I, the city and its academy were originally established to house Roman soldiers captured after the defeat of the Emperor Valerian, a beginning that foreshadowed its unique destiny as a crucible of cultures. But Gondishapur was far more than a prisoner of war camp. It evolved into a vibrant university city, a sanctuary for scholars fleeing religious persecution in the Byzantine Empire, and a deliberate project by the Sasanian state to cultivate a center of wisdom that could rival anything in the East or the West. Its legendary library was the dynamic heart of this enterprise, a living repository that didn't just store knowledge, but actively synthesized it, creating entirely new fields of study through a spirited collaboration of the world's greatest traditions. What made Gondishapur truly exceptional was its role as the world's first great international university. The academy was a bustling mosaic of intellectual traditions where the logical frameworks of Greek philosophy met the empirical herbal knowledge of Persia, the advanced numerical systems of Indian mathematics, and the rigorous linguistic scholarship of Syriac-speaking Christians. The city became a safe haven for Nestorian Christians who were branded heretics in the Byzantine realm, and these exiled scholars brought with them priceless Greek texts, particularly the works of Aristotle and Galen, which they had meticulously translated into Syriac. At Gondishapur, these works were then translated again, this time into the Middle Persian language of Pahlavi, all under the patronage of the Sasanian court. This was not a passive transfer of information, it was an active creative process. In the halls of the academy, a Greek medical theory would be debated by a Persian physician, tested against the vast Indian pharmacopoeia documented in the Sushruta Samhita, and then refined by a Syriac scholar who added his own clinical observations. The library's shelves were a testament to this fusion, holding texts in a dozen languages, all organized to facilitate this cross-pollination of ideas. The crown jewel of Gondishapur's academic achievement was undoubtedly its medical school and teaching hospital, a concept that would revolutionize the practice of medicine for centuries to come. The library was the essential support system for this pioneering institution. It housed the definitive translations of the entire works of Galen and Hippocrates, which formed the core curriculum for medical students. But it also contained original Persian texts like the Husrav-i Kawatan-u Ridak, a medical compendium commissioned by King Khosrow I, and Indian texts on surgery and the use of medicinal plants. This integrated knowledge was then applied in what many consider the world's first teaching hospital, where students learned theory from the library's books and then followed experienced physicians on their rounds, observing diagnoses and treatments firsthand. The legacy of this method is profound. It established a model of medical education based on the triad of theoretical study, clinical practice, and empirical research, a model that would later be adopted and perfected during the Islamic Golden Age and eventually make its way to medieval Europe. The physicians trained at Gondishapur were renowned across Asia, sought after as personal doctors by caliphs and emperors for their superior skills and encyclopedic knowledge. The decline of this magnificent center, however, was a complex process intertwined with the fall of the Sasanian Empire itself. Following the Arab-Muslim conquest in the mid-7th century, Gondishapur did not suffer the same immediate, catastrophic destruction as the royal library at Ctesiphon. For a time, it even experienced a brief Indian summer as the early Umayyad caliphs, recognizing the value of its scholarly tradition, continued to patronize its medical school. The real threat was not a sudden fire, but a gradual but inevitable gravitational pull. The rising new cities of the Islamic world, particularly Baghdad, founded in the 8th century, began to actively recruit the very scholars who formed the backbone of Gondishapur's faculty. The most famous example is the founding of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad by the Abbasid Caliph Al-Ma'mun, which was directly modeled on the multicultural, translation-centered approach perfected at Gondishapur. In a profound historical irony, the Abbasids systematically lured away Gondishapur's finest minds, including the powerful Bakhtishu family of Nestorian physicians, who served as the personal doctors to the caliphs for generations. The vast intellectual treasury of the Gondishapur library was not burned. It was methodically transferred, its texts retranslated now into Arabic, the new lingua franca of science. This transfer of knowledge was Gondishapur's ultimate legacy and the cause of its own obsolescence. As the best scholars, the most important manuscripts, and the flow of royal patronage shifted to Baghdad and other emerging centers, the academy and its library slowly faded. Without its star faculty and its unique role as the primary mediator between Greek and Eastern knowledge, Gondishapur could no longer compete. The library's collections likely dwindled through neglect and dispersal, its groundbreaking medical texts becoming standard reference works in Baghdad's new hospitals, its philosophical commentaries fueling debates in Cairo's libraries. The city itself gradually receded into a provincial backwater, its glorious past buried under the sands of time and shifting political fortunes. The story of Gondishapur's library, therefore, is not one of pure loss but of metamorphosis. Its physical existence may have dwindled away, but its soul, its synthesized knowledge, its interdisciplinary methods, and its very model of a university was reborn on a grander scale, providing the essential foundation for the scientific revolution that would illuminate the medieval world and ultimately pave the way for the European Renaissance. Before the marble halls of the imperial libraries rose in Rome, knowledge was a far more personal and perilous possession, a symbol of status and power fiercely guarded in the private villas of the Republic's elite. This was the world of the private library, and no figure embodied its spirit more than the statesman and philosopher Marcus Tullius Cicero. For men like Cicero, a library was not a luxury. It was an essential tool for political life and intellectual refuge, a sanctuary where he could converse with the great Greek thinkers through their texts to hone his rhetoric and steady his mind amidst the chaotic tumble of Roman politics. His letters to his friend Atticus are filled with urgent requests not for wine or finery, but for specific Greek scrolls, revealing a man for whom the acquisition of knowledge was as vital as the acquisition of power. He meticulously organized his collections, separating his Greek and Latin texts into different rooms, creating a physical manifestation of the two cultural worlds he sought to master and synthesize. The primary method by which these magnificent private collections were assembled, however, reveals a darker side to Roman intellectualism, systematic plunder. Unlike the state-sponsored acquisition of the Ptolemies in Alexandria, Roman libraries were often born from the spoils of war. As Roman legions conquered the Hellenistic world, they treated the great libraries of Greek cities not as cultural treasures to be preserved, but as assets to be looted. The victorious general would claim the most prestigious collections as his personal prize. The conquest of Macedonia, for instance, saw the royal library of the Perseus seized and brought to Rome. When the Roman general Aemilius Paulus sacked the city of Pella, he didn't just take its gold, he took its books, gifting his sons with a library that would shape their education, and by extension, the future of Roman literature. This practice was so commonplace that the very composition of a Roman aristocrat's library became a public record of his military successes, a display of cultural conquest that mirrored his territorial ones. This culture of acquisition through conquest meant that the fate of a library was inextricably tied to the fate of its owner. In the stable confines of the early empire, collections could be passed down through generations, but during the violent death throes of the Republic, they were profoundly vulnerable. The proscriptions, the brutal state-sanctioned purges that saw politicians declared enemies of the state, were not just political murders, they were also acts of cultural vandalism. When a man was proscribed, his property was forfeit, his villas were looted, and his name was erased. His library, that carefully curated repository of his intellect and ambition, was often the first thing to be seized or destroyed by political rivals or greedy soldiers. The scrolls themselves, painstakingly collected over a lifetime, could be scattered, burned as kindling, or repurposed for mundane uses, their philosophical dialogues ending as stuffing for a crate or wrapping for fish in the marketplace. The personal tragedy of Cicero himself serves as the most poignant example of this vulnerability. After his courageous speeches against Mark Antony following Caesar's assassination, Cicero was added to the proscription list. Hunted down at his seaside villa, he was murdered, and his head and hands were gruesomely displayed in the Roman Forum as a warning. What is less often recounted is the fate of his beloved libraries. His villas in Tusculum and Formiae, which housed his life's work and his treasured collections, were almost certainly pillaged, while some of his writings survived because they were already widely copied and circulated. His personal copies, his annotations, his working library, the intimate physical connection to his thought process vanished in the political firestorm. The destruction of a private library like Cicero's was more than the loss of books. It was the erasure of a personal intellectual universe, a dispersal of the very tools a mind used to navigate and shape its world. The legacy of these lost Republican libraries is a complex one. On one hand, the plunder of Greece initiated a massive and crucial transfer of knowledge to Rome, fundamentally shaping Latin literature, philosophy, and law. The very act of looting those Greek texts forced a cultural confrontation that would define the Western tradition. Yet, the chaotic and personal nature of their curation also meant that their survival was a matter of chance. Countless unique commentaries, personal histories, and original works by Roman authors who did not achieve Cicero's fame were lost forever in the sacking of a single villa. The private libraries of the Roman Republic thus stand as a powerful metaphor for the era itself, brilliant, ambitious, and built upon conquest but ultimately fragile, their treasures scattered to the winds by the very political violence that their owners both decried and at times instigated. While the great libraries of the ancient world succumbed to fire, conquest, and decay, our journey now brings us to a center of learning that shone with unparalleled brilliance during what we often call the European Dark Ages. As the lights were going out in the west, a new beacon was being kindled in the heart of Cairo, a testament to the enduring power of knowledge to flourish even in the most turbulent of times. This was the Dar al-Ilm, the House of Knowledge, the magnificent library of the Fatimid Caliphate. Founded in the year 1005 by the visionary Caliph al-Hakim by Amr Allah, this institution was conceived as a direct and ambitious rival to the legendary House of Wisdom in Baghdad. But where Baghdad's focus was on the translation and synthesis of Greek and Persian knowledge, Cairo's House of Knowledge had a unique dual purpose, blending deep religious mission with a boundless thirst for the secular sciences. The scope of its collection was staggering, filling over 40 rooms in a sprawling complex adjacent to the Caliph's main palace. Its holdings were a mirror of the Fatimid dynasty's own identity as the leaders of the Ismaili branch of Shia Islam. Consequently, the library amassed what was undoubtedly the most comprehensive collection of Ismaili theological and philosophical texts in the entire world. Shelves groaned under the weight of meticulously copied treatises on esoteric interpretation of the Quran, complex legal rulings, and the profound writings of the Ismaili intellectual missionaries known as the Dais. This was the definitive archive of a major school of Islamic thought, a centralized repository designed to equip the state's religious and administrative elite with the intellectual tools to govern a vast and diverse empire. Yet, to picture this as merely a religious library would be a profound mistake. True to the spirit of the age, the Fatimids embraced the entire cosmos of human inquiry. Alongside these sacred texts were vast collections dedicated to astronomy, medicine, mathematics, logic, alchemy, and grammar. The library employed a permanent staff of librarians, copyists, and bookbinders, and it operated with a remarkably modern open-door policy. Ink, paper, and pens were provided free of charge to any scholar, regardless of their faith or origin, who wished to study within its halls. It became a vibrant, humming academic commons, where Jewish physicians consulted Arabic translations of Galen, Christian astronomers debated planetary motion with Muslim mathematicians, and poets recited their latest works in its shaded courtyards. Among its most breathtaking treasures were the Qurans it housed. These were not mere functional copies for prayer. They were masterpieces of the bookbinding and calligraphic arts, objects of breathtaking beauty that reflected the wealth and piety of the Fatimid court. Scribes used inks laced with powdered gold and lapis lazuli, transforming pages into dazzling displays of swirling Kufic and graceful cursive scripts. The bindings were often crafted from intricately tooled leather or even precious metals, making each volume a sacred object worthy of the divine word it contained. To hold one of these Qurans was to experience a fusion of artistic splendor and spiritual devotion, a physical manifestation of the Fatimid belief that the pursuit of knowledge in all its forms was an act of worship. The golden age of the House of Knowledge, however, could not survive the political collapse of the dynasty that nurtured it. The slow decline began in the 12th century as the Fatimid Caliphate weakened, plagued by internal power struggles, famines, and the rising threat from both the Crusader states and the Sunni Seljuk Turks. The maintenance of such a vast cultural institution required a stable, wealthy, and committed state, and as the treasury emptied, the funds for the library's upkeep dried up. The final blow came with the fall of the Fatimid dynasty itself in 1171, when the great Sunni general Saladin, founder of the Ayyubid dynasty, took control of Cairo. For Saladin, the library was a potent symbol of the heretical Ismaili Shiism he sought to suppress. He ordered the Dar al-Ilm to be closed, and its immense collection was effectively sentenced to death by dispersal. What followed was not a dramatic, single fire, but a long, slow, and heartbreakingly mundane tragedy of neglect and repurposing. Without a budget for preservation, the delicate paper manuscripts began to succumb to the damp Cairo air, insect larvae, and simple brittleness. The state treasury, seeing the collection as a financial asset, began to sell off the most valuable volumes. Priceless scientific and literary works were scattered to the four winds, some ending up in private collections, others lost forever in transit. But the most ignoble fate befell a significant portion of the collection. Historical accounts, including the Chronicle of the scholar al-Makrizi, record a deeply sobering detail. He writes that the bindings of the books were cut off for reuse, and the pages themselves, filled with the accumulated wisdom of centuries, were sold off by the cartload to grocers and druggists in the city's markets. These pages, inscribed with the works of philosophers, the formulas of mathematicians, and the exquisite calligraphy of the most beautiful Qurans, were pulped into scrap paper to be used for wrapping butter, spices, and other goods. It is a haunting image, the words of a scholar's life's work, the meticulous calculations of an astronomer, the divine verses of the Quran, all ending their journey stained with grease and discarded in a Cairo alleyway, a silent and profound metaphor for the fragility of human knowledge when it falls out of political favor. The loss of Cairo's House of Knowledge was a quiet cataclysm, a great library not consumed in a blaze of glory, but dismantled piece by piece, its voice extinguished not with a bang, but with the slow, crinkling whisper of paper being crumpled and thrown away. Our journey through the lost libraries now turns to a kingdom divided, a realm whose very memory has been shaped by the accounts of its rivals. To the north of Jerusalem lay the kingdom of Israel, with its magnificent capital of Samaria perched atop a strategic hill. While the Bible and archaeological records tell us much about its powerful kings and turbulent politics, they are silent on the existence of a formal royal library. Yet, the very nature of a sophisticated monarchy in the ancient Near East makes its existence not just possible, but almost certain. Think of the day-to-day administration required to govern a nation, levying taxes, recording legal disputes, corresponding with vassal states, and drafting treaties with powerful neighbors like Egypt and Aram Damascus. A royal archive would have been the indispensable administrative heart of the kingdom, a centralized place where scribes meticulously documented the affairs of state on papyrus scrolls and parchment. While we may never find the grand hall that housed it, the ghost of this library speaks to us through the humble, broken pieces of pottery found in the ruins of the city. The most compelling evidence for this sophisticated bureaucracy comes not from gold or grand inscriptions, but from these shattered fragments of everyday life, the Samaria Ostraka. Discovered in the early 20th century among the ruins of the royal palace complex, these pottery shards are essentially ancient tax receipts or shipping labels. Inscribed in early Hebrew script, they record the delivery of luxury items, fine wine, and ancient olive oil from outlying villages to the royal court. A typical Ostracan might read, "In the 10th year from the village of X to the king, a jar of fine oil." These brief utilitarian notes are the fossilized paperwork of a centralized economy. They reveal a kingdom organized enough to have a standardized dating system, a network of administrative centers, and a dedicated class of scribes who could read and write. These ostraka are the scattered index cards that fell from a much larger filing cabinet. They strongly suggest that the perishable papyrus records, the real meat of the historical record, the royal annals, the diplomatic correspondence, the detailed legal codes, were stored somewhere within the palace precincts, forming a collection that would have told the full, unfiltered story of the Kingdom of Israel in its own voice. The ultimate fate of this hypothetical library is one of the most definitive and violent in our entire exploration. In the late 8th century before the Common Era, the relentless military machine of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, under the rule of Shalmaneser V and then Sargon II, set its sights on the rebellious Kingdom of Israel. The capital, Samaria, endured a brutal 3-year siege, a testament to its formidable defenses. But around 722 before the Common Era, the walls were breached. The Assyrian conquest was not merely a change of leadership. It was an act of calculated annihilation designed to shatter a national identity forever. The biblical Book of Kings describes the stark outcome. The Israelite elite were deported to distant parts of the Assyrian Empire, and foreign peoples were brought in to resettle the land. This policy of population exchange was the ancient world's ultimate tool of control, severing a people from their homeland, their cultural centers, and their collective memory. In this context, a royal library would not have been spared. It would have been a primary target. For the Assyrians, the destruction of a kingdom's archives was a final, symbolic act of victory. The papyrus and parchment scrolls containing the royal genealogy, the histories of the kings, the land deeds, and the covenants with their God would have been torn from their shelves and put to the torch. A library is the soul of a nation, and the Assyrians were experts in soul killing. The fire that consumed Samaria would have been an inferno of identity. incinerating the very documents that could have told us about the court of King Ahab and his infamous wife Jezebel from their own perspective, or given us the northern kingdom's version of the prophecies of Elijah and Elisha. The complete and total silence from the Israelite side of history is a direct result of this systematic erasure. We are left with only the southern kingdom of Judah's account in the Hebrew Bible, which often portrays its northern neighbor as a land of idolatry and schism. The Library of Samaria, if it existed, held the story that could have balanced that narrative, a story that was utterly consumed in the fires of 722, leaving behind only tax receipts and the haunting silence of a lost kingdom. Meanwhile, along the sun-scorched arteries of the Silk Road, where ideas traveled as freely as spices and silk, another great citadel of knowledge rose from the sands, a city so magnificent it was known as the Queen of the World. This was Merv, a sprawling oasis metropolis in what is now Turkmenistan, a crossroads of civilizations where Zoroastrian high priests, Nestorian Christian scholars, Buddhist monks, and Muslim philosophers once walked the same bustling streets. For centuries, Merv was not just a trading hub. It was a veritable university city, home to observatories, madrasas, and a constellation of libraries that served as the intellectual engine for the entire Eastern Islamic world. Its libraries were not housed in a single building, but were scattered across the city in mosques, private mansions, and academic institutions, each collection reflecting the astonishing diversity of thought that converged in this desert paradise. One might find a library dedicated to the precise astronomical tables of the great scholar Omar Khayyam, who worked here, alongside another holding ancient Syriac medical texts translated from the Greek, and still another safeguarding Buddhist sutras brought by merchants from the East. This was a place where the entire known corpus of science, philosophy, and faith was gathered, debated, and advanced under the vast Central Asian sky. The vibrant intellectual life of Merv was supported by a sophisticated infrastructure of knowledge preservation. The city was a major center for the nascent papermaking industry, a technology that had traveled west from China along the very trade routes that made Merv rich. Local workshops produced a steady stream of durable paper, far more efficient than papyrus or parchment, allowing scribes and scholars to copy texts on an unprecedented scale. The libraries themselves were often architectural marvels, with high, vaulted ceilings designed to keep the interiors cool and dry, and rows of wooden Ral lecterns holding open the precious codices for study. Patronized by enlightened Seljuk rulers and wealthy merchants, these institutions were more than static repositories. They were dynamic workshops of thought. Mathematicians refined algebra, physicians compiled comprehensive medical encyclopedias that would be used for centuries, and geographers produced maps that charted the world from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The collective output of Merv's scholars represented the very pinnacle of the Islamic Golden Age, a synthesis of global knowledge that made the city a luminous beacon on the intellectual map of the medieval world. This golden age of learning was extinguished with a suddenness and brutality that still shocks the conscience. In the early 13th century, the thunderous approach of the Mongol armies under Genghis Khan heralded a new and terrifying era. In 1221, the task of subduing the powerful Khwarezmian Empire, of which Merv was a key jewel, fell to Tolui, the youngest son of Genghis. The city, trusting in its legendary fortifications and a large garrison, initially chose to resist, but after a brief siege, the governor, hoping to avoid a worse fate, made the catastrophic decision to surrender. The gates were opened and Tolui's army poured into the city. What followed was not a simple military occupation, but a meticulously orchestrated act of terror designed to paralyze the entire region with fear. The Mongol forces systematically drove the entire population, men, women, and children, out onto the plains surrounding the city. For an entire day, the soldiers methodically divided the people into groups to be counted and processed, a chilling prelude to the horror that was to come. Then the slaughter began. Historical accounts, particularly from the Persian historian Juvayni, describe a scene of almost unimaginable cruelty. The Mongols, following a standing order from Genghis Khan to crush any potential resistance with absolute finality, put the vast majority of the population to the sword. The number of dead is disputed, with some medieval chroniclers claiming a figure as high as 700,000. A number that is likely a profound exaggeration, but speaks to the scale of the catastrophe as it was perceived by contemporaries. Yet, for the city's intellectual class, death was not the only or even the worst fate. In a deliberate act of cultural annihilation, Tolui ordered that the scholars, imams, and engineers of Merv, the very minds that constituted the city's greatness, be separated from the rest. These learned men were not granted a swift end. In a symbolic gesture of utter contempt for their knowledge, they were rounded up and drowned in the very canals that had sustained the oasis for millennia. Their life-saving waters turned into an instrument of their execution. Their vast libraries, the accumulated wisdom of centuries, were then put to the torch. Countless manuscripts, from poetic divans to scientific treatises, were dragged from their shelves and burned in giant pyres, the ink and paper that held the secrets of the stars and the human body fueling a fire that lit up the desert night. The sack of Merv in 1221 was more than a military conquest. It was a cognitive extinction event. The destruction was so total, the eradication of its educated class so complete, that the city's intellectual legacy was effectively severed at the root. While Baghdad's House of Wisdom would suffer its own destruction a few decades later, its knowledge had already radiated outward, influencing other centers. Merv's downfall was so swift and absolute that its unique scholarly contributions, its local histories, and its specific philosophical commentaries were largely erased from the living tradition. The city itself never fully recovered its former glory, dwindling into a backwater as the Silk Road routes shifted. The silence that fell over its libraries was profound, a void where once a chorus of diverse and brilliant voices had debated the nature of the universe. The story of Merv's lost libraries stands as one of history's starkest warnings, a testament to how quickly the most advanced and cosmopolitan centers of civilization can be utterly dismantled. Their light not just dimmed, but deliberately and systematically snuffed out, leaving behind little more than ashes and the haunting whisper of what was, forever silenced by the relentless tide of conquest. And so, as our journey through these silent halls of lost wisdom draws to a close, a profound and sobering pattern begins to emerge from the ashes. The stories of these 25 libraries are not isolated tragedies. They are interconnected chapters in a single, sprawling epic about the fragility of human memory. When we step back, we see that their destructions, though unique in their details, fall into a few heartbreakingly predictable categories, revealing the most persistent threats to our collective knowledge across the millennia. The most brutal and common destroyer has always been war and conquest. This was not collateral damage, but a deliberate strategy. From the Assyrians systematically erasing the identity of Samaria to the Romans obliterating Carthage in an act of cultural erasure, victors have long understood that to conquer a people, you must first conquer their past. The sack of Constantinople by fellow Christians in the Fourth Crusade and the Mongol annihilation of Merv demonstrate that this tactic transcends any single culture or creed. It is a universal weapon of domination. In these acts, libraries are not mere buildings caught in the crossfire, they are high-priority targets. Their burning is a symbolic castration of a civilization, a way to ensure that the conquered cannot draw strength from their own history to rise again. The knowledge lost is not just the content of the scrolls, but the very context of a people, their own voice telling their own story, replaced forever by the narrative of the conqueror. Equally devastating has been the fire of ideological purity, the fervent belief that one truth must eclipse all others. This is the story of the Serapeum in Alexandria, torn down by a Christian mob led by Patriarch Theophilus, its contents deemed heretical. It is the story of Friar Diego de Landa, burning the Maya codices in Mani to cleanse the new world of the devil's scripture. And it is the haunting, if debated, tale of the House of Knowledge in Ctesiphon, where a caliph's decree may have sent centuries of Persian and Zoroastrian wisdom up in smoke. In these moments, knowledge is not seen as a neutral resource but as an active threat. The destruction is an act of theological or philosophical hygiene, a violent simplification of the world where complex, competing ideas are replaced with a single, unquestionable dogma. The loss here is not just of information, but of entire ways of seeing the universe, the pluralistic, the heterodox, the mystical, all silenced in the name of a singular truth. Then there are the great, indifferent forces of nature which can erase our greatest achievements with utter randomness. The volcanic surge that buried the villa of the papyri in Herculaneum was a geological event, wholly unconcerned with the philosophical treasures it was simultaneously destroying and preserving. The fires that repeatedly ravaged the libraries of Constantinople and Rome were often accidents sparked by lightning, an overturned lamp, or the simple chaos of urban life. These disasters highlight a different kind of vulnerability, the physical nature of knowledge itself. Papyrus burns, parchment rots, and ink fades. For all our intellectual grandeur, our memory has always been housed in profoundly fragile containers, susceptible to a spark, a flood, or the slow, inexorable dampness of a forgotten cellar. This is a battle against entropy itself, a race we are always on the verge of losing. Perhaps the most insidious enemy, however, is not a dramatic explosion, but the quiet, slow-motion tragedy of neglect. This is the story of the Aksumite libraries, whose codices crumbled away in abandoned monasteries as the kingdom's economic and environmental foundations failed. It is the story of the Library of Celsus in Ephesus, whose magnificent shell stands empty, its collection likely dwindling away through centuries of apathy and shifting priorities before the final scroll was lost or repurposed. And it is the heartbreaking fate of Cairo's House of Knowledge, whose pages were sold as scrap paper in the marketplace, their divine and scientific words ending their days wrapping fish and spices. Neglect is the enemy that works in silence without malice or intent. It is the culmination of 1,000 small failures, a lost budget, a migrating scholar, a changing trade route, a disinterested heir. It proves that a library does not need to be stormed by barbarians to be lost. It can simply be forgotten, its value fading from memory until its physical form follows suit, crumbling into dust from sheer lack of care. Stepping back from this tapestry of loss, we are left with a humbling realization. The survival of knowledge is not the default state of human affairs. It is the fragile exception, a miracle that requires constant, active defense. Each of these lost libraries represents a fork in the road of history, a potential path of understanding that was forever closed off. We are left with the plays of Aeschylus that we will never read, the astronomical charts of the Maya we will never decipher, the Carthaginian histories we will never study. Their disappearance has left us intellectually poorer, forcing us to reconstruct the past with a handful of fragments, forever wondering about the full picture. This long, mournful history is not just a catalogue of burned buildings, it is a permanent warning. It teaches us that the greatest threat to our civilization is not necessarily the invasion from without, but the erosion of the very foundations of memory and understanding from within. The silence of these 25 libraries echoes through time, a powerful reminder that the preservation of knowledge is not a passive act of storage, but a continuous, conscious choice, one that every generation must make anew, lest the light of learning, so hard-won, flicker and die once more. As we reach the end of this journey through the silent halls of vanished knowledge, the sheer weight of these collective losses begins to settle, revealing a cultural and historical void of almost unimaginable scale. It is not merely the physical destruction of 25 buildings we mourn, but the extinction of entire worlds of thought. Think of the countless voices that have been forever silenced, the complete plays of Sophocles and Aeschylus that would have reshaped our understanding of Greek drama, the advanced astronomical charts of the Maya that mapped the cosmos with a precision Europe would not achieve for centuries, the detailed histories of Carthage written by its own citizens, offering a perspective untarnished by Roman prejudice. We lost the foundational scientific texts of the Library of Alexandria that proposed a heliocentric solar system 2 millennia before Copernicus, the intricate medical knowledge of Gondoshapur that fused the best practices of East and West, and the unique philosophical commentaries of the Sasanian Desai, Nippish that explored Zoroastrian cosmology. Each burned scroll, each scattered codex, and each pulped manuscript represented a unique thread in the vast tapestry of human understanding, and their absence has left us with a fragmented, incomplete picture of our own past, forever guessing at the full brilliance of what once was. This grand narrative of loss, woven from fire, conquest, and neglect, serves as a permanent and sobering lesson in the profound fragility of our collective memory. Civilizations that built monuments in stone, whose empires spanned continents, discovered that their most enduring legacy, their knowledge, was often their most vulnerable. The story of these libraries teaches us that the preservation of wisdom is never guaranteed. It is a continuous, active choice that every society must make. The forces that destroyed them, the ideological fervor that burned the Serapeum, the calculated cultural erasure that obliterated Carthage, the sheer destructive chaos of the Mongol sack of Merv, and the slow, quiet decay that claimed the libraries of Axamar not relics of a distant past. They are ever-present dangers, reminding us that the lights of learning require constant vigilance and unwavering support to keep from being extinguished. And so, this history is not just a chronicle of what was lost, but a powerful call to action for our own time. The modern equivalents of these ancient repositories, our public libraries, our national archives, our university collections, and even our digital databases, are the direct inheritors of this legacy. They are the bulwarks we have built against a new dark age, the institutions that now stand guard over our stories, our data, and our art. They need our active engagement. You can become a part of this vital chain of transmission. Visit your local library and remember the citadels of learning it continues. Support the digitization efforts of organizations working to create permanent, accessible records of our cultural heritage, ensuring that a single disaster cannot wipe out our memory again. Advocate for the funding of these essential institutions, recognizing them not as luxuries but as the very foundation of an enlightened society. The story of these 25 lost libraries is ultimately a story about us, about our capacity for both creation and destruction, and our enduring responsibility to safeguard the flame of knowledge for those who will come after us. We have the power to ensure that the tragic silence that fell over the halls of Alexandria, Nalanda, and Merv does not repeat itself. We are now the custodians. The choice is ours. We would love to hear which of these lost libraries captured your imagination most profoundly. Was it the tragic, mysterious end of the Royal Library of Alexandria, the daring technological innovation of Pergamum that gave us parchment, or the heartbreaking, clandestine rescue of the Timbuktu manuscripts in the face of modern extremism? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue this vital conversation about preserving the echoes of our shared